Chapter 515, Finances. 2. Madame Zhou wasn't good at business, so Matriarchy had been making up for the losses of the public funds over the past few years. Matriarchy's personal funds were almost gone by now. Even if she wanted to make up for the difference, she just wasn't able to. In order to maintain such a large noble estate, they needed money for almost everything. He Erlang hadn't found a wife yet, and her daughter and granddaughter were now living with her. The thought of all the building expenses sent Matriarchy into a fit of worry. All this had been hidden before, but now that the truth was laid bare before them, she had no choice but to face the reality of things. Ying was also dumbstruck. If she hadn't gone through the accounts herself, she wouldn't have known that the bright and luxurious estate was actually just a shell of its former self. The income from the public assets was now unable to make ends meet. "Mother, what should we do now?" Eldest Madame Ying wasn't able to make money appear out of nowhere. Although she had some savings, she had never thought of taking them out to help House Jingon. A migraine was building up in Matriarchy's head. She had been able to manage the household and its businesses well in her younger days, and she had saved away a good amount of money. She had never had to worry about the finances of their estate. Who could have thought that she would still have to worry over these matters in her old age? How pitiful. The originally lively room sunk into a long period of silence. Everyone lowered their heads and kept their mouths shut. No one had anything to say, whether it was the outspoken Ying, the timid and weak Pan Ninjin, or even Matriarchy's trusted servant Senior Servant Liu. Matriarchy was under a tremendous amount of pressure, but she couldn't think of any solution at the moment. Money was such a strange thing. When they had more of it, it didn't feel like they had enough. When they had less of it, it made things so much more difficult. "Do you have any ideas?" In her urgency, Matriarchy suddenly threw the question to the handmaids in the room. Muxiang had been standing quietly to one side, her silence making her seem like an unmovable statue. When Matriarchy turned towards her with expectant eyes, she softened her expression. She paused in thought for a moment before suggesting, "Matriarch, if our estate requires more funds, why don't you ask for Gillen Restaurant back?" She had only been intending to take the profits of Gillen Restaurant for a few months, especially since she had been the one to give Gillen Restaurant away in the first place. However, times were different now. Since the estate was in desperate need of money and the matriarch's own savings couldn't cover the lack of funds, she no longer had the same reservations as before. The matriarch had refrained from this extreme action in the past out of consideration for the third branch and because the third branch had no position or power back then, and she had doted on Chu Lian. However, everything had changed. Setting aside the fact that he Sanlang had been given the title of Marquis, Chu Lian was on such good terms with Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia that the prince's estate had sent over countless gifts every season. Gillen Restaurant wasn't worth that much in the eyes of the third branch now, but it could cover the expenses of the entire estate if it were placed into the public accounts. In the end, the matriarch was swayed to their side. Matriarchy nodded. "All right, since it's a time of emergency, let's do that first." Sanlang's wife isn't an unreasonable person. When they come over to visit in the evening, I'll explain it to Sanlang's wife. Muxiang nodded and retreated a step. No one noticed the strange expression she had. Actually, even if the stores in House Jingan's name weren't doing well, they wouldn't have made such a loss so quickly. As much as Madame Zhou had grafted from the public funds for her own pockets, she hadn't taken enough to push the Jingan estate into poverty. Thus, this extreme deficit of silver was actually Muxiang's doing. Matriarchy had entrusted her with the account books for a period of time. Eldest Madame Ying was elated by this turn of events. Ever since the day she had wandered over to the little study that Muxiang had been working in and happened to notice the profits from Gillen Restaurant, she had been scheming to get the restaurant in her hands. As long as the matriarch took Gillen Restaurant back, she naturally had her own ways to convince the matriarch to let her manage Gillen Restaurant. By then, she could gloss over some expenses and gather a few thousand taels for herself. Greed leaked into He Ying's eyes at the thought of it. Her dowry had only been 10,000 taels of silver. That was actually already a huge fortune. As long as she managed it well, she would never have had to worry about living the rest of her life. However, some people were just too greedy. When she found out that Gillen Restaurant's monthly profits were worth a few thousand taels, her mind had already been set on that sum. There was no going back. Senior servant Liu hadn't expected them to have decided on such a terrible measure. She wanted to give some advice, but since the matriarch had already made the decision, she would only be attracting unnecessary attention by speaking up at this time. She glared unhappily at Mu Xiang, who had brought up the idea in the first place. Her brows drew together in a frown. For some reason, she was starting to feel that there was something off about Mu Xiang. However, when she observed the maidservant closely, she couldn't tell what was wrong. Senior servant Liu sighed inwardly and decided to find a chance to sit down to talk with her later. After helping He Changqi with all the matters in the estate, He Changdi returned to Songtao Court for a moment before stepping out again. Since he was now an administrator of appointments, even if he hadn't officially received his position, there were still many things that he had to take care of. Even during the emperor's specially mandated leave, he had to find some time to work on official business. Chapter 516, An Invitation from Hao Xing. 1. It was already 1 p.m. by now, and this was when Chu Lian just woke up from her afternoon nap. She got up from bed and had a lazy stretch before entering her little study. Although she wasn't the lady in charge of the Jing'an estate, there were still plenty of matters for her to take care of within her courtyard. The first item on her to-do list today was a thick letter that had arrived from the northern border. It was from Manager Qin and contained reports about the trade market with the barbarians. She had to finish reading all the pages of the letter and come up with some appropriate suggestions for Manager Qin before sending someone to mail it back to the north. The jewelry store that she had opened with Royal Princess Duanjia, Treasure Pavilion, hadn't produced any new designs for a while. Yesterday, Princess Duanjia had mentioned to her while she was at the Wei estate. She had to find some time this afternoon to draw up a few more new and unique designs and send them over quickly. After listing out her tasks in her mind, she realized that there were really quite a few matters on her hands today, enough to keep her busy for the entire afternoon. She tackled Manager Qin's letter first. He had sent a really thick envelope with at least 20 or more sheets of paper inside. Chu Lian noted down some of the more important questions as she read, in preparation for her reply later. However, she had only made it halfway through the letter when senior servant Zhong requested to meet with her. Chu Lian frowned. The servants of Songtao Court were all sensible enough to avoid interrupting her while she was taking care of proper business, so this was likely an emergency. She set down the letter in her hands and moved over to a sofa before calling out to the maidservants outside to let senior servant Zhong in. The old servant entered with a face full of worry. She quickly bobbed in greeting before she spoke in a hurry. "Third young madam, this old servant has something to report." Chu Lian instructed Wenqing to bring 2 cups of honey water in. "Unless it's a matter of life or death, it won't help to be so rushed. Momo, take a seat and have a sip of water to calm your nerves first." Despite her earlier urgency, Chu Lian's words were somehow able to get senior servant Zhong to calm down. Once she had calmed down and regained a clear mind, senior servant Zhong couldn't help smiling inwardly. It really was just as third young madam had said. As urgent as the matter was, there was no point in being so anxious as she would be more likely to make a mistake in that state. The warmth of the honey water sliding down her throat settled her nerves and senior servant Zhong was able to give her report with a steady voice. Chu Lian set down the teacup in her hands. Her tone didn't hold any of the alarm or anger that senior servant Zhong had expected. She only seemed slightly surprised at the most. "So what you're saying is that grandmother wants me to give Gillen Restaurant's deed to the public accounts?" Senior servant Zhong nodded helplessly. The servants of the third branch didn't just keep to themselves in the estate after all. Senior servant Zhong was also someone that He Changdi had specially trained, so she had her own ways to watch for news in the estate. It wasn't strange that she had been able to discover the movements from Qingxi Hall so quickly. A corner of Chu Lian's lips tugged downwards. Since matriarchy had started showing her displeasure towards her, she had already foreseen such a day coming. She just hadn't expected it this soon. The income from Gillen Restaurant was too dazzling after all. Just as birds would die in pursuit of food, men would perish for money. This was the same even amongst the nobility. The matriarch had likely come to this decision with the help of eldest Madame Ying. She hadn't reopened Gillen Restaurant even now, in preparation for this day. Gillen Restaurant was a golden goose in the eyes of those who coveted it. However, only Chu Lian knew that Gillen Restaurant was nothing but a dead goose without her. Senior servant Zhong waited for a long time for third young Madame's reply. When she finally raised her head to peek at Chu Lian, she realized that third young Madame was just daydreaming while staring blankly into the air. The corners of her mouth twitched. She was stunned speechless. Even she, as a servant, was already anxious beyond belief, yet third young Madame seemed to be in a daze. She knew that the profits that Gillen Restaurant brought in every month were enough to support all the monthly expenses of the Jingan estate with more to spare. Although most people were greedy for money, could it be that third young Madame didn't care about the profits at all? Chu Lian really didn't. While she had brought Gillen Restaurant up all by herself and it was indeed a very profitable restaurant, she was no longer the penniless third young Madame who had just entered the Jingan estate. She had the shares from Treasure Pavilion and the profits from the northern market in her pockets now. The money earned from either venture was magnitudes above that of Gillen Restaurant. However, even though she didn't really care about the profits from Gillen Restaurant, that didn't mean that others could simply take it for themselves. When Gillen Restaurant had come into her hands, it had just been a deserted little restaurant bleeding money from the Jingan estate every month. She had used her own dowry to renovate it and bring it back to life, putting in her time and effort into rebuilding it. She had even made a special plan for its reopening to turn the nameless little restaurant into one famed across the entire capital, even transforming it into a place of amusement for nobles. Out of all the effort required to transform Gillen Restaurant into its current state, all that matriarchy had contributed was a deed worth 300 taels at the maximum. However, when it came to sharing the spoils, everyone wanted a part of it. There was no such thing as a free lunch in this world. Even if she was disinclined to fight for her share, that didn't mean that she wouldn't do it. Senior servant Zhong was getting a little antsy. She and the other servants of Songtao Court had watched how third young Madame had made Gillen Restaurant a success with their own eyes. No one else knew better than they did how much third young Madame had put into Gillen Restaurant. Matriarchy wasn't being fair with this move. The deed had been transferred under the name of third young Madame back then. They had even registered it with the authorities. Chapter 5:17. An invitation from Hao Xing. 2. Senior servant Zhong couldn't tell what Chu Lian wanted to do, so she could only try asking, "Third young Madame, are you really going to hand over Gillen Restaurant?" Chu Lian returned to reality and showed a faint smile. She was still young. Her features were more mature as compared to the previous year. Now that she had lost some baby fat and gained a little more elegance and womanly grace, she seemed even more beautiful than before. When she smiled like this, in a mischievous and charming manner, no one could keep their eyes away from her. "I'm not going to hand it over to them. I'm not that kind." The unexpectedly childish tone startled senior servant Zhong into a smile. Her unrest and unease washed away with her master's reply. "So third young Madame has a plan already. Then this old servant can stop worrying blindly." Although third young Madame was young, everyone in Songtao Court respected her, even an old servant like Senior Servant Zhong, who was already halfway into her grave. Senior Servant Zhong smiled once again. Since that's so, this old servant won't disturb third young madam any longer. This old servant will take her leave. Chu Lian waved in acknowledgement of Senior Servant Zhong's dismissal. When the old servant stood up, she seemed to have thought of something else as she spoke up again. This old servant heard from Wenqing and Wenlan just now. Third young madam was injured in the north. Please do take care of nourishing your body and recovering from your old wound now that you're back. This old servant does not have many talents, but this old servant has studied fertility treatments for women before. Yesterday, this old servant also consulted with great Dr. Miao on this matter. From today onwards, this old servant will help third young madam with nourishing the body for fertility. Senior Servant Zhong was one of his Sanlang servants, so there was nothing she had to be cautious about. Chu Lian nodded in agreement. Senior Servant Zhong was happy to receive her agreement and quickly left the study, preparing to make some soup for Chu Lian. Actually, Wenlan had told her about third young master and third young madam's nightly activities the past 2 nights. Third young master was brimming with vigor at his age, but third young madam was much younger. Her body seemed so slender and fragile, it couldn't possibly bear the full force of third young master's affections. She had to help third young madam nourish her body so that the couple would be able to have a child as soon as possible. Chu Lian wouldn't have expected Senior Servant Zhong's motives to be so complex. Once the old servant had left, Chu Lian had dived right back into her work. By the time dusk had fallen, she finally walked out of the little study and sent couriers off with letters and the designs for jewelry. Xian came over to her with an invitation in hand and a troubled expression. Chu Lian was seated at the desk with Wenqing gently kneading her shoulders. She had holed herself up in the study for an entire afternoon, so her shoulders had gotten a little sore. Wenqing's massage was helping to relax them again. Who sent that invite? Chu Lian glanced over at Xian as she asked. Xian presented the invitation respectfully to Chu Lian with both hands. Third young madam, it's from Hao Xing. Chu Lian was startled for a moment. After the whole incident with Maya's hen's miscarriage, she had almost forgotten that they had bumped into Chu Qijing on the way back from the Wei estate and what Chu Qijing had said to them. She flipped open the invite and scanned through its contents. So it was for Chu Yuan's coming-of-age ceremony. She was about a year older than Chu Yuan, so it was indeed time for 8th Miss Yuan to come of age. Although she wasn't the original Chu Lian and she didn't know much about what Chu Lian had faced in the Ying estate, her servants would mention the past from time to time, especially Xian and Senior Servant Gui, who had been with her the longest. She recalled what Senior Servant Gui had told her. At the coming of age for this body of hers, no guests had been invited at all. It had been a simple dinner with family where her elders had taken care of all the ceremonial steps. Although she hadn't thought much of it since she hadn't experienced it personally, the corners of Senior Servant Gui's eyes would turn red whenever she spoke of it. Now looking at the gold-embossed invite for Chu Yuan's ceremony, it was clear that the difference of treatment for both of Chu Qisheng's daughters was like heaven and earth. Xian was standing right next to Chu Lian, so she could see the contents of the invite as well. When third young madam remained silent, she assumed that her master was thinking of past memories and her eyes slowly filled up with hot tears. She wanted to tell third young madam not to go, but this was 8 Miss Yuan's coming-of-age ceremony. As terrible as the days at the Ying estate had been for 6th Miss, she was still 8th Miss' older sister. She couldn't choose not to go after receiving an invite. Third young madam. Xian called out to Chu Lian worriedly. Chu Lian returned to her senses and set the invite down on the table. When she turned to look and saw that her silly handmaid was already close to tears, she found it a little funny. She teased Xian, "What's wrong? Who bullied you? Tell me who it was and I'll serve justice for you." The mischievous grin on Chu Lian showed how little she had been affected by the invite. Xian hurriedly shook her head and squeezed out an awkward smile. No, no, this servant is fine. No one dares to bully this servant. Chu Lian shot a mock glare at her. Then why are you crying? Go wash it off with some warm water. You're already an adult, why are you still such a crybaby? When Xian left, senior servant Gui piped up, "Third young madam, it's fine if you don't want to go." Based on Chu Lian's current status, it really was as senior servant Gui said. No one would hold her to it or gossip about her if she didn't go. However, it was her maiden house that had sent the invite. If she refused to socialize with them at all, others might not mention it to her face, but they would still look down on her behind her back. Chu Lian blinked innocently. Of course I'm going. I'm doing so well for myself, why wouldn't I go? After saying so, she winked playfully at senior servant Gui. When senior servant Gui got over her startlement, she broke out into a smile as well. That's right. There was no reason for third young madam not to go. Out of all the misses in Housing, the house she had married into was the most highly ranked. Furthermore, third young master was completely devoted to third young madam. He had even received the title of Marquis recently, together with an important position at court. With these conditions, what did third young madam have to fear when returning to the Yin estate? Chapter 518, Lack of Table Manners. 1. He Changdi had sent a messenger in the afternoon to inform her that he would be returning late tonight, so Chu Lian didn't need to wait for him to have dinner. When it was time, Chu Lian set off to make greetings to the elders as per usual. Since it was still rather early, Chu Lian brought Wenqing and Xian to her mother-in-law's residence first. In the last few days, Countess Jingan had been drinking the medicine made with the Snow Mountain Mist's flower. The medicine, paired with acupuncture, had greatly improved her health, so she was now able to get out of her bed and walk more frequently. Since Maya's hen's child had been saved and she didn't have anywhere else to stay, she had remained at Countess Jingan's courtyard. When Chu Lian entered the parlor, Countess Jingan was sitting cross-legged on the hearthbed and playing with Little En and Little Lin. Little En was already 7 years old this year and was becoming more aware of her surroundings. She had become increasingly quiet, perhaps due to the separation of her parents. She sat silently by Countess Jingan's side, toying with a Chinese ring puzzle. The 5-year-old Little Lin was at the age when children were the most mischievous. She was livelier than her sister and was calling out for a handmaid to play cat's cradle with her. Countess Jingan was watching her granddaughters with a doting expression. When she heard a servant announce that Chu Lian had come, she beckoned Chu Lian over. The quick-witted maidservant quickly moved a stool over to Countess Jingan's side. "Lianer, come sit with me." Chu Lian smiled and curtsied towards Countess Jingan before taking a seat on the stool. When Countess Jingan noticed that Chu Lian was looking at the children, she sighed and said, "Madame Zhou might have made some mistakes, but the children are innocent. The ones who were hurt the most by Dalong's divorce are Little Lin and Little En. I couldn't trust the servants in Dalong's courtyard, so I'm temporarily raising them here. I don't have much to do anyway, so I might as well occupy myself with something." Countess Jingan was actually explaining Little En and Little Lin's presence in her courtyard to Chu Lian. To be frank, Chu Lian didn't know her mother-in-law well as she hadn't spent much time with her. Countess Jingan had been bedridden since the start of her marriage, so Chu Lian didn't have a good grasp of her personality. However, Chu Lian had gotten some insights during the ruckus over the miscarriage. What was a good way to phrase it? Countess Jingan was a good person, but she was too weak and naive. She was also easily swayed by the words of others. With those qualities, it would be hard for her to take on the role of lady in charge, a role which required both wits and willpower. Perhaps it was due to her years spent bedridden, or perhaps Count Jingan had shielded her too much from reality. Even at her age, her thoughts were still so innocent. Although she was similar to the matriarch in the sense that she couldn't wait to see her eldest son, Changchi, have an heir, she would never mistreat her granddaughters in the process. This could be seen from the fact that she had the two young ladies move over the moment Changchi and Madame Zhou divorced. From little Lin and little An's expressions and actions, Chu Lian could tell that the two children loved their kind and gentle grandmother very much. Countess Jean Gan's request for candied hawthorns that day had probably come from someone else whispering by her ear, leading her into unintentionally creating the drama that had happened. As for Miaojin, Chu Lian believed that Miaojin couldn't possibly have put the child in her womb at risk, as long as she truly liked Changchi and wished to birth a son for him, as well as to stabilize her position in House Jingan. The mournful wails from Miaojin they had heard that day was proof of that. It's wonderful that little Lin and little An have you to take care of them, mother. Chu Lian's words had come straight from her heart. The two girls had just lost their mother and their father, as the heir of his house, wouldn't be able to focus on them and give them the care and attention that they dearly needed. Thus, their grandmother's care was sorely needed to help fill the lack of maternal love in their lives. While little An continued to quietly fiddle with her Chinese ring puzzle, Countess Jingan petted her head. Chu Lian noticed her mother-in-law's eyes turning a little red, so she quickly changed the subject. Mother, how has your health been recently? The swell of emotion in Countess Jingan's heart was disrupted by Chu Lian's timely interruption. She then replied, Great Dr. Miao comes by every afternoon to treat me with acupuncture. I can feel my health improving drastically every day, thanks to his treatment and medicine. Just look at me now, I can already get off the bed and move around. This morning, I even brought little An and little Lin out for a stroll in the garden. Chu Lian nodded as she listened. If Countess Jingan could be cured of her long-time illness, that alone would make her trip to the northern border worthwhile. It would also mean that Chang's perilous journey to Mount Aming to obtain the Snow Mountain Mist's flower hadn't been made in vain. Mother, it's great that you're feeling better, but please do be careful not to tire yourself out. Lianer, don't worry about that. I've already experienced the pain of being bedridden for years. Now that I've gotten better, I'll definitely cherish my body more than ever. Chu Lian smiled and nodded. Her mother-in-law might be weak, but she wasn't a fool, and that was good enough for her. Since Countess Jingan was still undergoing treatment, she didn't have to go to Qingxi Hall to pay her respects, but Chu Lian still did. Seeing that it was about time to go, she mentioned that she had to leave and got up after bidding her goodbyes to the Countess. However, Countess Jingan grabbed her hand out of the blue. After hesitating for 2 seconds, she forged ahead with her words, Lianer, I believe Sanlang has already spoken to you about your aunt. I've been observing the events of the past few days, and it seems like the matriarch is becoming increasingly dissatisfied with your branch of the family. She's already getting on in age and she has an unreasonable person like your aunt by her side, so it can't be helped that her actions have been a little irrational. Please be more forgiving towards her as your elder. Chapter 519, Lack of Table Manners. 2. Chu Lian was astonished. It was obvious that she hadn't expected such words to come from her mother-in-law at all. It seemed like even a naive person like her mother-in-law could tell that there was something wrong with the matriarch's attitude. Countess Jingan's description was extremely tactful. The way she had put it was that the matriarch was dissatisfied with their branch of the family. How could the matriarch be dissatisfied with the third branch? Sanlang was her most accomplished grandson, and she was probably more fond of him than his brothers. There was no way she'd be dissatisfied with him, so matriarch he was obviously only dissatisfied with just her alone. People often said that it was hard to be a wife and marry into someone else's family. Chu Lian hadn't felt that way at all in House Jingan previously, but now she was experiencing exactly what the saying meant for herself. Chu Lian grinned. She was very grateful that her mother-in-law cared about her enough to give her such advice. Don't worry, mother, I'm aware of that. Countess Jean Gon spoke a few more lines of advice before letting Chu Lian go off. 15 minutes later, Chu Lian arrived at Qingxi Hall. While walking down a corridor, she bumped into senior servant Lu, who had just came out of the warm parlor. When senior servant Lu noticed Chu Lian, she hastily stepped forward to welcome her. Third young madam, senior servant Lu had already greeted her, although she was still some distance away. While senior servant Lu had a smile on her face, it didn't reach her eyes. Chu Lian suddenly figured out that there was something else going on. "Momo, where are you heading to?" While Chu Lian was speaking, senior servant Lu took the chance to raise her hand and make a gesture while everyone else was focusing on Chu Lian. Chu Lian's expression froze before turning into a smile. "Since Momo is busy, don't let me hold you back. I'll go pay my respects to grandmother now." Senior servant knew that Chu Lian had understood from the look in her eyes. She nodded, curtsied towards Chu Lian, and quickly walked out of the bounds of Qingxi Hall. Chu Lian paused in her tracks for a moment. Senior servant Lu had made a gesture indicating the act of drinking wine. This obviously referred to a place where wine was served, a restaurant. The only restaurant that could be related to her was Gillen Restaurant. Just as senior servant Zhong had said, the matriarch had probably set her heart on taking Gillen Restaurant back. The signal from senior servant Lu was likely a warning that the matriarch was going to mention this matter to her today. This was out of Chu Lian's expectations. She hadn't thought that they would become so impatient as to actually snatch food right off her plate. What a complete lack of table manners. Before Chu Lian even entered the heated room, a servant had already scurried in to report her arrival. Her aunt-in-law, He Ying, was in the room. She gave a little cough, glanced at matriarch He, and smiled. "Mother, it won't be too good if you speak later. Let me take the burden off your hands and be the bad person." The matriarch thought about it for a moment before nodding. Chu Lian was led into the warm room by a maidservant. She then greeted them both as a junior family member. Matriarch He was seated in the middle with Mu Xiang behind her, earnestly massaging the matriarch's shoulders. "Sanlang's wife, there are no strangers here. Have a seat." The edges of Chu Lian's mouth curved upwards. After thanking the matriarch for her kindness, she took an empty seat on the matriarch's right side. "Has Sanlang come back yet? My husband mentioned that he would be having dinner outside and that he'll be home late tonight." Matriarch He asked a few more superficial questions, clearly trying to make some small talk, before falling silent. Eldest Madam He Ying was getting a little impatient. She gauged the matriarch's mood from her expression first, before her eyes darted from side to side. She interrupted the conversation as if she had just thought of something. "Mother, if I remember correctly, your birthday is coming soon. Are we going to hold a large celebration this year?" Chu Lian glanced at her aunt-in-law with her eyebrows raised slightly. While her lips were obviously raised into a smile, He Ying had a weird feeling as if Chu Lian had already seen through her motives long before she had even mentioned it. The matriarch showed a bitter smile in response to the question. "Dalong's recent divorce hasn't reflected well on our house. Let's forget about celebrating my birthday this year, it's not a major milestone anyway. When the time comes, we can just have a nice reunion dinner with family. Besides, our estate is lacking in funds now. It's better if we save more." He Ying let out a startled expression. "Mother, how can that do? Even if we're low on funds, we'd rather save more from our daily spending than just let your birthday pass without a proper celebration. Don't you agree, Sanlang's wife?" A faint smile hung on Chu Lian's face, but she didn't answer her aunt-in-law's question. Chu Lian's indifference and refusal to take the bait made He Ying extremely vexed. A new idea sparked in He Ying's mind and she changed strategies. "Mother, how about this? Tell me how much our estate needs. If the amount is within my capabilities, it'll help to make up for it, all right? No matter what, you must be able to have a proper birthday celebration." He Ying shot Muxiang a look while speaking. Muxiang looked at the matriarch awkwardly, and the matriarch helplessly glared at He Ying. Miss Ying, do you really think your mother is that useless? To actually need your contributions? Let me tell you frankly, our estate is indeed severely lacking in funds. A large part of it is due to Madame Zhou, but we're not in as dire a state as you think. Besides, we still have Sanlang's wife's Gillen restaurant helping to keep us afloat. Once Gillen restaurant reopens, we'll be able to survive this period of hardship just fine. Chu Lian was laughing inside. After the many twists and turns, they had finally moved on to the main topic. It had truly been tough on this mother-daughter pair. Chapter 520, I'll let you have it. 1. At this moment, Chu Lian really wanted to ask one question. When on earth had she even consented to putting all of Gillen Restaurant's earnings into the public funds? She also wanted to remind Matriarch He that it had been the matriarch herself who had said that Gillen Restaurant would belong to Chu Lian back then. No matter how much it earned, all profits would belong to the third branch. Unfortunately, there was no such things as video or voice recordings in this era, so even if she pointed these out, they would never admit to it. After Matriarch He spoke, He Ying's brows immediately furrowed together. She looked towards Chu Lian. That's right. Sanlang's wife, the Longtative festival has already passed. Why hasn't Gillen Restaurant opened up for business? Practically every other shop in the capital has already opened by now. There wasn't any expression in particular on Chu Lian's face. She put on a benign smile and said, I ordered the managers to renovate the restaurant and it was delayed until now, which is why it hasn't reopened. How's the renovation going? The matriarch asked. It's nearly complete. Since it's almost finished, it's better not to delay the reopening date for too long. Do reopen as soon as possible then. Chu Lian smiled at her. He Ying had been keeping a close eye on Chu Lian's expression. Noticing that there wasn't a trace of disagreement in her, He Ying continued, Sanlang's wife, I've also heard Mother mention that Gillen Restaurant was given to you, and that the deed is in your hands. However, when all's said and done, you're part of our He family now. Right now, the estate's public funds are severely lacking. Using the profits of Gillen Restaurant to fill the estate's coffers was something that Mother had no choice but to do. I hope you'll understand why Mother did this. At her age, it's not easy to keep this large estate going. He Ying paused, fully into her role as a caring senior, but there's something I need to be frank with you about, please don't get angry. Chu Lian was tempted to reply with, if you know I'm going to get angry, you might as well not say it. He Ying stared at Chu Lian, believing that there was nothing but absolute sincerity in her eyes right now. I've been by Mother's side longer than you have. Gillen Restaurant was part of the dowry given to my mother by my grandmother. Back when I got married, Mother couldn't bear to give it to me, yet she gave it to you. From that, we could see how important you are to Mother. However, in the end, the long-established Gillen Restaurant still belongs to Mother. Chu Lian tilted her head to the side and met with He Ying's gaze. And, if there's something you're trying to imply, please say it straight. When the edges of He Ying's mouth curved upwards, the wrinkles at the sides of her lips looked like they were carved into her skin, giving her the appearance of an extremely harsh person. Sanlang's wife, I like your straightforward attitude. Fine then, I'll state it bluntly. Since you know that Gillen Restaurant's earnings have been drawn into the public accounts now, it isn't very appropriate for the deed to be in your hands, don't you think? After all that setup, they just wanted to take Gillen Restaurant back and appropriate it for themselves. He Ying was using the logic of a bandit. A mocking thought popped up in Chu Lian's mind. Going by her aunt-in-law's logic, if she stayed long-term in their house, then the deed of the house should naturally belong to her. She would have retorted back in a temper, if not for the fact that the person in front of her was House Jingan's matriarch and He Sanlang's own grandmother. Chu Lian had to keep in mind her position as a He family daughter-in-law, and the deed had indeed been a present from the matriarch. Otherwise, she wouldn't have tolerated all this. If all they wanted was Gillen Restaurant, she would let them have it. With an indifferent expression, Chu Lian asked the matriarch, "Is this your stance as well, grandmother?" There was an awkward look on the matriarch's face. She had just recalled that she had stated that all earnings would be theirs when gifting Gillen Restaurant to Chu Lian. She had even assigned manager Qin to be Chu Lian's assistant for this purpose. In the end, she was the one who had broken her promise first. At this moment, she didn't know how to compose herself. However, when she thought about the monthly profits of Gillen Restaurant, matriarch Hees became resolute. She bore with the embarrassment, gritted her teeth, and nodded. "Samlang's wife, lay the blame for this on me. Our estate truly needs the funds right now. This decision is certainly unfair to you, so let me make it up to you. I'll take responsibility and transfer 2 fabric stores from the public accounts to you in exchange. What do you think?" Fabric stores. How funny. Was the matriarch going to ask for those back again once she made them profitable like Gillen? She was taking Chu Lian for a fool. Chu Lian turned her head back and beckoned Wenqing over. The handmaid took out a long wooden box from her sleeve and handed it over to Chu Lian. Chu Lian stood up from her seat, took 2 steps forward, and placed the box on the table by the matriarch's side. Chu Lian spoke up, "Grandmother, since this is your wish, then I shall return this deed to you in the exact same condition as it was when you gave it to me. Like Aunt said, Gillen Restaurant wasn't originally mine, it was part of your dowry. You're the lady in charge of the house, grandmother, so I'll defer to you. Now that Gillen Restaurant has been transferred to the public accounts, it naturally won't be of any concern to me. From now on, all matters regarding Gillen Restaurant will be handled by you, grandmother." After a slight pause, she continued, "As for the stores you mentioned for exchange, I wouldn't dare to accept them. My younger cousin, Miss Pan, hasn't found a match yet, so please keep it for her dowry instead." Chapter 521. I'll let you have it, too. Both matriarch He and Hing hadn't expected Chu Lian to let go of Gillen Restaurant so easily. To them, this was truly an unexpected surprise, as they had prepared many more ways to convince her that they hadn't even used. They were overjoyed right now. Despite the slight sarcasm contained in Chu Lian's speech, they couldn't care less about that. Would a wolf that had just stolen a large juicy steak mind a few barely visible shards of bone on the meat? Matriarch He was ecstatic. As long as she had Gillen Restaurant, she wouldn't have to worry about providing funds for her daughter or dowry for her granddaughter. "Samlang's wife, I know that this matter is unfair to you. Don't worry, I'll definitely make it up to you." Matriarch He spoke with passionate sincerity, as if she would actually make it up to Chu Lian. Chu Lian got up and curtsied towards the matriarch. "It's getting late, I shall not bother grandmother and aunt any further. I'll take my leave now." With Gillen Restaurant in hand, the matriarch and Hing had no need for Chu Lian any longer, so the matriarch waved her hand to dismiss Chu Lian. Once Chu Lian and her maidservants had left the parlor, Hing hurriedly opened the wooden box and took out a stack of deeds. She carefully examined the official seal on the deeds under the light of a lantern for a long moment before bursting into an excited grin. "Mother, these deeds are all real." Matriarch He glared at her daughter. "Of course they are. She wouldn't dare to fool me with fake deeds." In actual fact, there were even extra pages tacked on to the original Gillen Restaurant deed that Chu Lian had just returned her. These were the deeds of the neighboring properties that had been bought when extending Gillen Restaurant's rear court. He Ying's eyes were glimmering as she stared at the deeds in her hands, as if she was looking at chests of gold. She asked eagerly, "Mother, since Samlang's wife has returned the deed for Gillen Restaurant, how about I go over in person tomorrow and tell the managers to hurry up with the reopening?" Before the matriarch even had the time to consider it, Hiying had already grabbed onto the matriarch's elbow as she pleaded like a spoiled child, "Mother, I'm your own flesh and blood, won't you rest easy if I'm the one doing things? I can bring Miss Pan out and buy her some jewelry too. It's been a while since she has come to the capital, but she doesn't have any decent sets of accessories. She's young, so she can't be wearing our old accessories. I heard that the jewelry sets of Treasure Pavilion are the best in the capital. I want to check out that place tomorrow." The matriarch turned to look at her obedient granddaughter who had been silent the whole time, and finally nodded. All right, go ahead. She's at the age where she's blossoming and she should dress up more." The ladies connected through 3 generations were all in high spirits tonight. Having seen everything that had happened, there was some doubt on Muxiang's face. She didn't understand why had Chu Lian had agreed to their demands and let go of Gillen Restaurant so easily. The earnings of Gillen Restaurant were nothing to scoff at. If it were anybody else, they'd probably be lamenting inside. At this point, she felt that she couldn't make sense of House Jingan's third young madam at all. When Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court, senior servant Zhong and the others had already prepared dinner for her. When Chu Lian had her meals, she didn't like having servants standing around, so she usually only kept one person by her side. Xian stayed in the parlor to serve the food, while Wenqing was called over by senior servant Zhong and senior servant Gui. When Chu Lian had returned from Qingxi Hall just now, the two had learned that third young madam had been bullied in Qingxi Hall from Xian's offhand comment. Thus, the 2 senior servants had been searching for a chance to grab hold of Wenqing for the full story. Wenqing had a bitter expression as she grudgingly said, "The matriarch asked for Gillen Restaurant back." Senior servant Zhong was utterly shocked. Although she had heard the news from servants in Qingxi Hall, the fact that this had happened so quickly was out of her expectations. The matriarch personally asked for it. Wenqing nodded. The profits from the restaurant were such a huge sum, of course the matriarch had to ask for it personally. Then, senior servant Gui asked hesitantly. Third young madam agreed to it. Third young madam had me bring the deed beforehand, and she handed it over to the matriarch just like that. Senior servants Zhong and Gui were both stunned silent. It took them quite a while to recover. Wenqing sighed. Third young madam had no choice in the matter. After all, Gillen Restaurant originally belonged to the matriarch. When the matriarch personally requested for it back, our third young madam couldn't possibly reject her. The 2 senior servants nodded. That was indeed the case, but the matriarch was also too unreasonable. How could an elder act like that? The 3 sighed in frustration. They wanted to complain on behalf of Chu Lian, but in the end they were just servants, and they weren't in any position to speak. However, senior servant Zhong thought that there was something strange about the whole matter. Third young madam had said to her that she wouldn't let the matriarch and the others have their way, yet she had returned Gillen Restaurant to the matriarch so easily, just why? Senior servant Zhong shook her head with a bitter smile. She couldn't understand third young madam's actions at all. Wenqing was right. Third young madam had no choice but to hand over Gillen Restaurant, or she would have started a fight with the matriarch. If Chu Lian and the matriarch turned against each other, the one that would suffer the most would be their third young master. In the end, third young madam had borne with the matriarch's unreasonable demands for third young master's sake. Senior servant Zhong inwardly decided that she would have to inform third young master of this matter when he returned. As for He Changdi, he wasn't out busy on official business like Chu Lian had thought. He was actually in a private residence right now, interrogating someone. Chapter 522, Interrogation 1. Deep inside a private residence, there was a dark and enclosed room without any windows, where it was hard to tell if it was even day or night. The cramped and claustrophobic space could push any sane person into a nervous breakdown after a period of time. There was an interrogation room set up right outside this enclosed room, where Changdi was seated at the head of the room with a cold expression. He waved his hand towards Liyue. "Bring her out." A moment later, Liyue led 2 guards into the enclosed room and they dragged out a person who looked to be on their last breath. They threw her in front of Changdi's feet. That half-dead person was clad in a light green dress, her hair disheveled and her face pale and haggard. The lifeless and empty expression in her eyes made her seem more like a corpse. With that distinctively soft and slender waist, who else could it be other than Fuyan? Fuyan remained unresponsive. She laid prone on the floor where she had been thrown, seemingly ignorant of the remnants of dried blood around her. She looked as if her soul had been taken away from her. Sanlang lowered his eyes and his icy gaze fell on Fuyan. "Speak. Who ordered you to do it?" Fuyan's whole body trembled when she heard Changdi's question, as if she had just been brought back to reality. She raised her pitifully dirty face. With dismay in her eyes, she pleaded, "Third young master, please. Please don't lock this servant up inside that pitch-dark room. This lowly servant will confess everything. This lowly servant will tell you everything that you want to know." After Fuyan finished speaking, there was a sudden foul odor spreading throughout the room. Her emotional breakdown had led to her physical incontinence. Beside her, Liyue immediately covered his nose in disgust. Changdi came out of the interrogation room 15 minutes later. Dressed in a black robe, he stood in the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back and stared up at the darkening night sky. His ramrod straight back appeared even more lonely and desolate under the dim light. Liyue came out to join him after a few moments. "Third young master, all she knows is that someone was sending her messages, she doesn't know who the sender was. She got hold of that letter during old Marquis Dingyuan's birthday banquet. Someone had specially sent it to third young madam and she just happened to be the one chosen as the messenger. However, she hid the letter and never delivered it to third young madam." Liyue reported all the details that he had found out to Changdi. Changdi's lips drew up into a cold arc. Xiao Wujing was truly resourceful. When Liyue didn't hear any response from his master, he hesitated for a second before asking, "Fuyan is already useless to us. What should we do with her?" Changdi rubbed the jade thumb ring on his left thumb with his finger. There wasn't any trace of emotion in his magnetic voice, but it sent chills down Liyue's spine. "Settle it." Liyue was stunned silent for a moment when he heard his order, but he quickly reacted and nodded, "This servant will take care of it." Liyue had worked under Changdi for many years, so he understood what his master had meant by those 2 words. Although he felt these measures were rather merciless, it was undoubtedly the best solution. Death was the only outcome for a traitor with such greedy ambition. Changdi nodded slightly before walking towards the outer court of the private residence. There was still someone else waiting for him. Today was the day that he would take care of all his debts. The subordinate guarding the entrance of the parlor gave Changdi a silent salute when he arrived. There were already 2 people seated inside the parlor. Xiao Hongyu was the first to walk up to him when he walked in. He gave a wide and silly grin as he greeted Changdi. "Brother since you've arrived, I'll leave these guys to you. I'll take my leave first." Changdi patted his shoulder. A moment later, there were only 3 people left in the entire parlor, which included himself, Mo Qingui and Huang Zhijin. Sanlang walked up to the seat at the head of the room and sat down. He lifted his lips into an unexpected smile. The strange smile didn't complement his cold and handsome features and sent chills down the backs of those present instead. "Uncle Mo, Uncle Huang, please sit." Mo Qingui and Huang Zhijin had already gotten up when Changdi entered. Although they were also veterans of the battlefields, they lacked the imposing and formidable aura that third young master carried. The immense pressure of his aura made them extremely tense. Although they knew that they shouldn't be acting this way, it was just a basic involuntary response to stress. It was completely out of their control. Mo Qinggui and Huang Zhijian looked at each other doubtfully before anxiously sitting down. There wasn't anyone else inside the parlor, so they were more or less sitting across from each other. It was so quiet that they could probably hear a needle dropping to the floor. The more the silence stretched, the more nervous the two old soldiers became. They waited for a long time for Changdi to speak. They were both becoming increasingly restless. In the end, Mo Qinggui was the first to break the silence. May I know what third young master has invited us over for today? Changdi's shadowed gaze swept over him. Are you sure you don't have the answer to that already, Uncle Mo? Mo Qinggui's scarred cheek twitched in response. The mocking tone in Changdi's words made his heart thump. He racked his mind for all the possible reasons. When a startling idea popped into his mind, his eyes abruptly widened and he looked at Changdi in shock. Is it because of third young madam? You may be getting on in age, but your memory is still as sharp as ever, Uncle Mo. Once Changdi confirmed his suspicions, it was as if the floodgates had broken. Mo Qinggui started sweating profusely. Despite the chill of the early spring night, his inner garments were quickly soaked with sweat. An hour later at the entrance of the residence, Changdi mounted his horse with a suave wave of his black brocade cloak. The sound of hoofbeats accompanied their departure as he led his men away into the darkness of the streets. Chapter 523, Interrogation. 2. Mo Qinggui and Huang Zhijian stood at the entrance of the private residence. They each had a horse in hand with dreadful expressions on their faces. The dim lantern light from the front gate illuminated their faces, giving Mo Qinggui's scarred face a yellowish cast as if it was covered by a layer of crude paper. He muttered weakly, "It's over. It's over. It's all over now. Brother, I've dragged you down with me this time." What else could Huang Zhijian say now? He just shook his head with a bitter smile. This was completely Mo Qinggui's fault. As a private soldier for a noble family, he had committed the worst taboo, disloyalty. He had good intentions at the start, but he had reported some baseless information to the matriarch. That had been a very foolish action. Most established military families kept private soldiers in their household. His band of soldiers had gone into service for the He family after serving under the old count in the army. They were considered the most experienced and respected generation of family soldiers. Once the private soldiers pledged their loyalty to the head of the household with blood-smeared lips, they would have to remain loyal to the household for the next 3 generations of family heads. If they failed to fulfill this oath, it would be regarded as betrayal. Although it seemed like the soldiers were on the losing end of the deal, that was not the case. The head of the household would take care of the next 3 generations of the soldiers' family in return for their loyalty. When it came time for succession, the private soldiers would simply follow the next head of the family. The blood oath would still be in effect. Huang Zhijian and Mo Qinggui knew that the next head of House Jingan would be second young master or third young master. Eldest young master occupied a cushy position within the capital. He would also need to inherit the title of Count Jingan in the future, so there was no way that he would become the next head of the family. The family soldiers would follow the orders of the head of the He family, not the successor to the noble title of Count Jingan. If there were some special circumstances, it would be possible to both inherit the title of Count Jingan and become the head of the family. This was the case for the current Count Jingan. However, judging by the current situation, it seemed like third young master had the highest possibility of becoming the next head of the He family. If third young master ever became the He family head, then their relationship with third young master would definitely be broken because of what Mo Qinggui did. Mo Qinggui's actions had silently killed the future prospects of the next 3 generations of their families. The future of a whole family with more than a dozen members was ruined because of a few careless words. Trouble stemmed from a loose tongue. Since it had already happened, it was useless even if Imo Chingue regretted it now. It was already around 9 p.m. when Sanlang returned to the Jingon estate. Most people were already asleep at this time during the Great Wu dynasty. Changdi found out that Chu Lian had already gone to bed when he entered Songtao court. When he met with senior servant Zhong, she was in the middle of cleaning up while holding a clay pot. With his sensitive nose, Sanlang detected the scent of medicinal herbs from the ceramic pot. He creased his brows as he asked, "What's this?" Senior servant Zhong was all smiles as she replied, "This old servant prepared some nourishing soup for third young madam." "Third young master, please don't worry. Great Dr. Miao has already looked over the prescription and approved of it. This old servant will personally brew the soup every day as well." Changdi finally relaxed after hearing senior servant Zhong's reassurance. "Third young master, you've only just returned home and it's already so late. Would you like some supper?" Changdi waved his hand in response. He took off his brocade cloak and handed it over to senior servant Zhong before entering the bedroom. He had been out for business for most of the day. Just half a day away from his dear little wife was enough to make him miss her terribly. He paused for a moment in front of the doors before entering the bedroom. A dim lantern had been lit inside the bedroom, so he was able to see everything inside. Sanlang strode towards the side of the bed with his long legs. He reached out with one hand and lifted the gauzy curtains around the bed, only to be greeted with the sight of a small lump in the middle of the large bed. The ice within Changdi's eyes slowly melted away as he stared at that small lump. His gaze even carried a hint of humor. He sat down carefully on the side of the bed and pulled the blankets away gently to reveal Chu Lian's delicate face and her lovely cheeks flushed from sleep. The early spring night was as chilly as a cold lake. Chu Lian was most afraid of the cold, so Shiyan and the others had heated up the blankets before she had settled into the bed. However, the blankets had turned cold again shortly after she laid down. His fragile lady seemed to be made of ice. Even if she slept in a warm blanket for a whole night, her hands and feet were still ice cold. Chu Lian's silky dark hair was scattered loosely around her, with a few strands covering her tiny face. Changdi reached out to tuck the stray strands behind her ears and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. Following that, he touched the hands and feet she had hidden under the covers. They were cold, as he had expected. A frown formed between Changdi's brows. He tucked her back into the blankets before finally going into the bathroom to wash up and change. Chu Lian's eyes fluttered open right after he left. The corners of her lips lifted as she touched the area that Changdi had just kissed. Satisfied, she smacked her lips and fell asleep for real. Changdi finished his bath swiftly. When he returned to the bed, he gently lifted the edge of the blanket and coaxed the curled-up Chu Lian into his arms. Sensing the broad chest with a familiar, safe scent, Chu Lian instinctively scooted over and buried herself in Changdi's embrace. They were both wearing thin sleep clothes and they had recently consummated their marriage. Their close proximity and intimacy was starting to make it unbearable for a certain someone. Chu Lian didn't feel anything since she was sleeping. She only took Changdi as a heated pillow. However, this was torture for Sanlang. His beautiful wife was in his arms, but he couldn't do anything. He was about to grind away his molars from all the restraint he was exercising. Chapter 524. He's not happy. 1. Chu Lian clung onto the new source of heat next to her out of habit. The softness of her chest was pressed closely against his body. While Sanlang still kept his usual icy expression on his face, the backs of his ears were already flushed red. He lowered his deep gaze to look at the petite woman in his arms. The hand that he had wrapped around Chu Lian's waist slipped downward slowly until it reached a soft and curved area. He didn't want to disturb her, so he settled for some light touching in the end. The first rays of dawn emerged from the horizon, setting off the drops of morning dew on the leaves outside. Chu Lian had gotten a good night's sleep. When she finally opened her eyes, the other side of the bed was already empty. She reached out and felt around the empty area. There was still some warmth left under the blankets and a familiar scent. Chu Lian furrowed her eyebrows slightly. Wasn't there a saying about men who had just awakened and how they were as voracious as wolves and tigers? So why was he Sanlang so restrained? Could it be that he didn't have any interest in that? Chu Lian shook her head. Considering the way he had acted the night they consummated their marriage, he didn't seem like someone who lacked desire though. However, she still wasn't all that comfortable with those sorts of activities, so it was actually a good thing for her if Changdi didn't want it. Chu Lian laid in bed with her eyes open as her mind wandered into flights of fancy. Wenlan seemed to have heard her movements from outside the room, so the maidservant walked over to the bedside and called out softly. Chu Lian pulled open the gauzy bed curtains and got out of bed. After she finished washing up in the bathroom, she sat in front of her dressing table and realized that there was already a bowl of soup placed there. Wenlan was in the middle of choosing a dress for Chu Lian when she turned her head and noticed the questioning expression in her master's eyes. She smiled. "Third young madam, I brewed that soup myself early this morning. It's a nourishing soup. Third young madam should drink it while it's still warm." Chu Lian took the bowl into her hands and scooped up a spoonful of the concoction. There was a faint aroma drifting up from the soup and she could detect a mixture of scents of medical herbs that she couldn't quite identify. She gave it a taste. Upon realizing that it didn't taste bad and that it was at just the right temperature to drink, she downed it in a few gulps. It was just a small bowl of soup, so there wasn't a lot of it. Wenlan hung the dress that she had picked out on the dressing screen before going up to Chu Lian to help style her hair. Chu Lian was currently picking out accessories at the dressing table. Did Momo say what this herbal soup was for? Wenlan didn't hide the truth from her and replied honestly. Great Dr. Miao said that third young madam's body is a little weak. There's also some remaining coldness within your body, which might have been caused by the low temperatures at the northern border. He had a discussion with Momo and they came up with a prescription for you. It's just 2 bowls of soup daily, 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening. A weak and cold body. Chu Lian smiled bitterly. That sounded about right. She had stayed out on the freezing, snow-covered plains of the northern border for an extended period of time. Moreover, she had just recovered from an injury then. It was already rather fortunate that she had come away from that with just some physical weakness and a slightly cold body. No wonder her limbs always felt cold when she slept without Sanlang. She never felt warm enough even after sleeping under thick blankets for the whole night. Wenlan had skillful hands. She quickly transformed Chu Lian's loose hair into one of the trendiest hairstyles in the capital. Chu Lian opened her jewelry box, thinking of picking from the accessories that Royal Princess Duanjia had sent over at the end of last year. However, she was stunned still when she opened the jewelry box. Her 5-layered mahogany jewelry box was filled with brand new accessories. A jade hairpin with a spiral-shaped topaz inlay, a flower-shaped clip with a pearl center and coral and agate petals, a jade phoenix hairpin, a sapphire necklace. She was almost blinded by the sight of all the precious accessories. She was very familiar with the designs of most of these accessories. How could she not? More than half of them had come from Treasure Pavilion. She had drawn those designs herself. But she hadn't requested for any of these. She had specifically told Royal Princess Duanjia that she didn't have to send her one of each accessory. She wouldn't be able to finish wearing them all since there were so many. Wenlan was watching Chu Lian's expression closely. The bewildered expression on the normally calm and clever third young madam caused Wenlan to give a snort of laughter. Chu Lian glared at her with a very clear meaning, urging her to give her an immediate explanation. Wenlan couldn't hold back the smile growing on her lips. third young madam, third young master picked all these out himself and had them sent over last night. Chu Lian was slightly surprised. These are from Heartwarming. Where did all his money come from? This whole pile of jewelry wasn't cheap. It would cost at least 4,000 to 5,000 taels. The jewelry at Treasure Pavilion were all high-end accessories. Although Heartwarming had been given a reward during the bestowal of his noble title, it wouldn't be enough to buy all these accessories. Wenlan was genuinely happy for her young madam, but she was also somewhat shocked. It seemed like third young madam really didn't know that third young master had bought so many accessories for her. With a quick turn of wit, Wenlan chose not to ask about the reason despite her curiosity. She changed the subject instead by asking, "Third young madam, why don't you pick one to wear now?" Chu Lian suppressed the suspicion within her heart. She picked out a pair of golden butterfly hairpins with ruby inlays and handed it to Wenlan. "This one." Wenlan inserted the golden butterfly hairpins on the two sides of Chu Lian's head. The butterflies were so realistic that they looked like they had just landed on her lush, dark hair, and their wings shook with the slightest movement of her head. They moved just like a real pair of butterflies. Wenlan looked at them and sighed in admiration. There was a reason why the accessories of Treasure Pavilion were so popular amongst the noblewomen of the capital. No one would have thought that their third young madam was the one who had designed these exquisite pieces. Chu Lian was also satisfied with the two golden butterflies. The craftsmen at Treasure Pavilion were very skilled and they had been able to express the essence of her designs in their work. Chapter 525. He's not happy, too. After changing into an azure dress embroidered with crepe myrtle flowers, Chu Lian asked, "Where's my husband?" Reporting to third young madam, third young master went to the martial arts arena early in the morning. He headed to the study immediately after training. Liu met him there, so it seems like they have some business to take care of. Chu Lian nodded. Since that was so, she didn't have to bother with Heartwarming's whereabouts today. She went to the parlor for breakfast after getting ready. Wenlan followed behind Chu Lian. She tried to speak up several times, but she was stopped by Chu Lian's glare each time she did so. Finally, Wenlan could no longer hold back her question when Chu Lian was seated and eating breakfast alone at the table. "Third young madam, should this servant go to the study and invite third young master over?" Chu Lian lifted her head and blinked innocently. She pretended as if she didn't understand. "What for? He's already a grown man, wouldn't he know when he's hungry?" Wenlan didn't dare to say anything else after hearing Chu Lian's reply. Chu Lian made short work of her breakfast. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with a handkerchief and rinsed her mouth. She immediately stood up and headed straight for her little study. Wenlan anxiously followed behind her. In the end, she shot a look at the junior maidservant behind her. The young maidservant quickly understood her meaning and hastily ran out towards the direction of Heartwarming's study. Chu Lian couldn't hold back her grin any longer once she settled down in front of the desk of her little study. That Heartwarming was really useless. He clearly wanted to please her and make her happy, but he chose to do it in such a sneaky and covert manner. He couldn't set down his pride to face her this morning, so he had deliberately gotten up earlier. She couldn't indulge this awkward tsundere personality of his. He deserved to suffer for his silly actions. In the main study of Songtao Court, Heartwarming sat ramrod straight in front of his desk with two stacks of official documents piled on top of the surface before him. His head was lowered and he was seemingly reading the document in his hands. Liu had been observing him the whole time while standing beside him. If he remembered it right, his young master had been staring at a blank page in that document for almost half an hour. Is he really reading? When a sudden knock sounded on the door of the study, Heartwarming's deep gaze immediately turned towards the door. Liu rushed to the entrance to answer the knock. A moment later, he shut the door and walked over to Heartwarming. Liyue really wanted to kill himself. His luck was seriously terrible. Why did he have to come look for his master at this time today? He had come right when his master and his wife were in the middle of a quarrel. He asked in a trembling voice, "Third young master, third young madam is currently having breakfast. Would you like to go over?" He Changde's stomach growled right as Liyue was speaking. He Sanlang's expression froze up and his handsome face immediately turned as black as the bottom of a pot. "Your young madam didn't send any message over at all." He Sanlang gritted his teeth as he sought confirmation. Liyue had a troubled expression on his face as he shook his head. Seeing how his master looked right now, Liyue really wanted to turn into a quail and hide in a corner so that no one could see him. "Then how is her appetite today?" "Ha ha." Liyue's eyes twitched. The maidservant who had come to report had told him that third young madam seemed to be in a very good mood. She had even eaten an extra steamed pork dumpling. In order to save his pitiful little life, it was probably better if he didn't mention that. Liyue continued to lower his head until it was almost buried into his chest. When He Changde didn't receive any response after a long moment, his expression turned so dark that ink was about to seep out from his pores. The temperature inside the study instantly hit sub-zero. Liyue felt like he was about to suffocate. He Sanlang continued sitting in front of his desk and sulked all by himself. After waiting for about an hour, someone else finally came over. Wenlan had personally come over this time. When Liyue saw that their next guest wasn't third young madam, he knew that the situation was bad. He went out to welcome Wenlan before she had even reached the entrance of the study. He pulled Wenlan over to the corridor outside the study. Liyue was so anxious that his brows were creased together. "Where's third young madam?" Wenlan pulled her arm away from Liyue's grip and gave him a good glare before she replied, "What's with all this tugging?" "Third young madam is in the little study." Liyue was on the verge of tears. Why wasn't third young madam looking for third young master at this time? Why had she gone over to the little study instead? Can't you see that third young master isn't happy? Hurry up and bring third young madam over. Wenlan rolled her eyes. Why do I have to invite third young madam over? Third young madam has some business to do in the study. I can't disturb her. Oh, my dear ancestor, don't you know what time it is right now? Do you even want to continue living? I'm begging you, please. Please go and invite third young madam here. Too lazy to bother with a response, Wenlan Simple turned around to leave, but Liyue blocked her way. Wenlan was getting a little angry. Why do I have to bring third young madam over? Third young madam didn't do anything wrong. It's not just third young master who's busy. Can't our third young madam be busy too? Liyue was stunned. When had this brat started siding with third young madam? It was He Changde who had arranged for Wenlan and Wenqing to be by Chu Lian's side. So they were ultimately considered He Changde's servants. As the two servants started arguing, He Sanlang had finally lost his patience within the study. Liyue and Wenlan were still quarreling when a shadow darted past them. By the time they regained their senses, all they could only see was third young master's tall back disappearing into the distance. Based on the direction he had gone, it seemed like he was going to look for third young madam. He Changde moved quickly and reached the parlor in no time. Senior servant Zhong was about to greet him when she saw him coming in, but he simply entered the little study as if he hadn't seen her at all. Chu Lian was in the middle of writing down some recipes when the brush in her hand was abruptly taken away. She raised her head with bewilderment, only to be met with the gloomy expression on He Changde's handsome face. The gloomy look in his eyes, the dark aura around him, the sharp angles of his furrowed brows and the thin line formed by his lips, all these signs were a loud declaration that he wasn't happy. Chapter 526, How Couples Should Communicate. 1. Chu Lian gave him a sideways glance as if she hadn't seen the look of complaint in his eyes. She picked up a brush from the rack and dipped it in the inkwell, seemingly intent on continuing her writing. This time, He Sanlang caught hold of her wrist. Chu Lian finally set aside the recipe in her hands. She looked up with furrowed brows as she asked, "What are you doing?" He Sanlang's handsome features were cast in a stiff expression and his lips were pressed together. He continued staring down at her with a shadowed gaze, as if hoping that Chu Lian would be able to read his thoughts from his eyes alone. Chu Lian met his gaze with her own clear, innocent eyes. She could see the mix of frustration and petulance in his gaze, and she even understood where he was coming from. However, not everything could be conveyed by his eyes alone. As close as they were, there would likely come a time where she wouldn't be able to read him with just one look. Chu Lian shifted her gaze away as she stated with a cool tone, "He Changdi, if you have something you want to tell me, then speak. Otherwise, get out. Don't disturb me." He Changdi's pupils contracted. He obviously hadn't expected such an order from Chu Lian. The grip he had around Chu Lian's wrist tightened unconsciously. When Chu Lian felt a sharp pain around her wrist, she struggled and tried to pull her hand away. "He Sanlang, you're hurting me." After He Changdi realized that her expression had even contorted from the pain, he quickly let go. A red mark in the shape of his grip stood out accusingly on her fair skin. That red mark kept the words that He Sanlang had been about to speak in his throat. However, seeing how Chu Lian had turned her back to him in a fit of pique while rubbing her wrist, the anger that he had just suppressed flared back up again. The couple continued their standoff in the study, Chu Lian remaining seated with her back to him. The tension between them filled the tiny little room and made it suffocating. Time seemed to have stopped and every second passed at an agonizingly slow speed. He Sanlang's eyes never left Chu Lian's figure. He stood frozen by the desk, his hands clenched tightly into fists behind his back and his lips pressed together in a thin, white line. He was waiting for Chu Lian to speak up first. Chu Lian had been angry with He Changdi's attitude ever since they had returned from the Wei estate. After that, although they had acted out a pretense together during the incident with Miaojin and he had bought a whole box of accessories to make her happy, he had never admitted his fault in the matter. He had also never explained the reason behind his attitude face to face. It wouldn't do for their interactions as a couple to be this way. While they were attracted to each other and in love for now, they lacked communication and trust between them. During their time together, Chu Lian had understood that He Changdi wasn't someone who liked to open his heart to others. They couldn't keep having miscommunications and quarrels like this. They had to sit down and face their problems together. Otherwise, if they continued on in this manner, it would only make things worse in the future. Chu Lian had already decided that she would lay her cards on the table and get rid of all their communication issues today. Thus, she was resolute on remaining silent until He Changdi spoke up. In the end, it was He Sanlang who sucked in a deep breath and spoke, "Lianer, we bumped into Xiao Bojian inadvertently that day and Prince Wei was the one who invited us all back to his estate." With her back still turned towards her husband, Chu Lian heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. She had been afraid that He Changdi's temper would rear its ugly head and that his pride would keep him from speaking. Although he had gone a little off topic with his first words, it was good that he had broken the silence first. That showed that he had realized it was his fault. Chapter 527, How Couples Should Communicate. 2. Chu Lian had actually been taking a chance. She had been betting on He Changdi's feelings for her. If he truly loved her with all his heart and treated her as his wife, then he would definitely speak up. However, if he had given up and left, their relationship as husband and wife would have ended right there. It seemed like He Changdi couldn't bear waiting any longer. Before Chu Lian could reply, he had already stepped forward, picking up the petite woman seated behind the desk and carrying her with ease over to the chaise at the side. He gently set her down on the inside of the chaise before settling down on the outside. The chaise wasn't very wide, so Chu Lien was pushed close to the wall. The limited amount of space meant that she was pressed against Yi Changde's solid chest and that they were facing each other eye to eye in close proximity. The space between Chu Lien's brows crinkled up. She didn't like being trapped this way, it felt more like an interrogation than anything. She reached out her arms, intending to crawl over to the other side of the chaise and escape Yi Changde's control. He Sanlang seemed to have seen through her intentions, as he retracted one of his outstretched legs and crossed it over his other knee instead. The position of his raised leg just happened to block off Chu Lien's escape route. Let's clear up everything today, like this. Yi Changde fixed his eagle-eyed gaze on her, destroying her chances of escape. With a wall behind her, Yi Changde's hard chest in front, as well as having her entire body within his reach, Chu Lien was like a little bunny who had fallen into a trap. No matter how much she struggled now, she wouldn't be able to get free. Yi Changde wrapped one arm around her waist and pulled her closer towards him so she wouldn't have to lean against the cold wall. He then set his other palm on the wall next to the side of her face so he loomed over her in a textbook cabotin pose. Chu Lien's heart was about to leap out of her chest from the tension. Yi Sanlang was just way too imposing in this position. Chu Lien felt that she couldn't summon up any courage like this, so she lowered her eyes, unwilling to meet with Yi Changde's shadowed gaze. When she dipped her head, quivering golden wings drew Yi Sanlang's gaze to her dark hair, where two brilliant, lifelike butterfly ornaments were dancing with her sudden movement. His heart clenched as he held his breath unconsciously. The rage burning in his heart faded a little. He remembered these golden butterflies clearly. He had chosen them himself. When he had picked them out, he had been imagining how lovely they would look on her. His imagination hadn't been too far from reality now that he was looking at the real thing. The ice in Yi Changde's gaze melted away, forming into pools of affection instead. He stroked Chu Lien's smooth hair and touched the two golden butterflies gently, setting off their quivering wings once more. His magnetic voice was as soft as it had ever been, beautiful. They suit you very well. Chu Lien had been busy thinking of how she should navigate the conversation ahead. When the compliment hit her out of the blue, she looked up with a confused expression, meeting Yi Sanlang's tender gaze straight on. As he quickly lowered his hand, she realized that he had been referring to the accessories she was wearing. A hint of sweetness blossomed within her heart. Who wouldn't be touched by a compliment from their loved one? However, Chu Lien's mind remained clear as glass. She wouldn't be led astray by a simple sentence from Yi Changde. Her brows formed into a frown. Yi Sanlang, since you want to have a proper discussion, don't change the topic. While Yi Changde's features remained unchanged, the emotions in his eyes were completely different now. Chu Lien had worn a simple and elegant azure dress today, made up of a long skirt and a long-sleeved blouse. Since the little study was heated, she hadn't put on a cloak or vest. While the winter dress was made with thick fabric, there was only a single layer of cloth. The skirt started at her chest, and there was a crepe myrtle flower embroidered right there. The light yellow flower rose and fell along with her breathing, making for a mesmerizing sight. Yi Changde felt his throat dry up instantly. His Adam's apple wobbled as he gulped hard and pulled his gaze away with difficulty. Finally, he spoke. TL note, this is what the dress looks like, so you can see why Yi Sanlang is drooling XD Ruchuan dress. Chapter 528, How Couples Should Communicate. 3. Lianer, can you avoid meeting Xiao Bojian in the future? Chu Lien blinked in astonishment before shaking her head inwardly. Yi Changde was really tsundere. However, she suddenly felt that there was something strange about his question. Was there something up with Yi Changde? Ever since she had gone to the north, she could sense that He Changdi seemed to be secretly guarding against Xiao Bojian. As if they had been born to be enemies. She had read the original novel, so she knew about the enmity between the two. However, the current He Changdi was just too different from his novel counterpart. It could be said that he and the gentle, straightforward He Sanlang from the book were two completely different people aside from sharing the same face. She had already struck out the possibility that he might be the same as her early on. However, from the way he treated his family, he didn't seem like a fake He Changdi at all. Then what on earth had caused his personality to change so much? Although Chu Lian really wanted to know the truth, it clearly wasn't the right time to ask now. She let out a helpless sigh. He Changdi, answer me this. When have I ever actively gone to meet Xiao Bojian? Wenqing and Wenlan are your servants. I'm sure that you know about everything I've done before I went to the north. Don't tell me that I have to list them all out for you again. His jealousy was completely unfounded. There was no reason for him to have thrown his little fit of temper. A glint flashed through He Changdi's eyes. Chu Lian was right. He knew every single one of her movements while she had been in the capital. He had indeed assigned senior servant Zhong and the Wen sisters to her side to keep an eye on her. Chu Lian had never tried to meet Xiao Bojian. When he had become the top scholar of the year, she had even politely rejected his invite to a celebration. Even so, there was a single scene in his memory remained like a thorn in his heart. He Sanlang reached out and stroked Chu Lian's soft cheek. His voice came out in a low rumble. Then what about that lucky jade amulet? Why is it in Xiao Bojian's hands? Chu Lian made a sound of confusion in response. She couldn't remember what amulet He Changdi was talking about. He Sanlang was a little unhappy with her response, so his tone dipped a few degrees. The jade amulet that grandmother gave to you the day after our wedding. Thanks to He Changdi's hint, realization dawned upon Chu Lian. So it was that lucky jade amulet. What did you say? That lucky jade amulet is with Xiao Bojian? He Changdi kept his eyes fixed on her, not willing to miss the tiniest change of expression on her face. I saw it with my own eyes. He was all too familiar with that jade amulet. It had belonged to the old count and he had seen that amulet pretty often ever since he was a little boy. He couldn't possibly have misidentified it. Chu Lian held a hand up to her forehead. She was completely speechless from this turn of events. She slowly thought back to the events of the day she had met with Royal Princess Duanjia at Defing Tea House. That was where she had lost the amulet. Her wide almond-shaped eyes darted from side to side as she thought. It couldn't possibly have been such an amazing coincidence, right? That Xiao Bojian had later come by to pick up the amulet she had dropped in that room. The corners of her lips tugged downwards as she realized that that really might have been the course of events. Chu Lian wanted to curse Xiao Bojian 100 times over. As expected of the main lead of a novel. His mind really worked differently from others. He had picked up an amulet that she had accidentally dropped and somehow taken it as a sign of her affection for him. She knew that He Changdi wouldn't be convinced if she came up with any sort of reason now. She weighed her options inwardly for a few seconds and decided to tell him the whole truth. He Changdi, that's exactly what happened. I didn't know that I dropped the jade amulet and he somehow picked it up. However, I think that Xiao Bojian isn't as simple as he looks. There must be some hidden power backing him. Otherwise, he couldn't possibly have lured the princess away so easily at the tea house. Chapter 529, How Couples Should Communicate. 4. Surprise leaked out from He Changdi's gaze. He hadn't expected the truth to be so absurd. However, Chu Lian's tone had been even and sincere, so it didn't seem like she was lying. His memories from his past had also corroborated Chu Lian's words. Xiao Bojian did indeed have some sort of power backing him. He Changdi had been exiled in his past life and he had entered the army under a pseudonym later on. Despite living far away from the capital and not knowing anything of the situation there, he had still managed to use his limited influence to investigate major events. A dangerous glint came to life in his eyes as he narrowed his gaze. Xiao Bojian. He was going to take back every debt owed to him and let him have a taste of his suffering from his past life. He Changdi quickly pulled himself away from his dark thoughts and stared at Chu Lian for a few seconds. The letter that Fu Yan gave me was something passed to her during old Marquis Dingyuan's birthday banquet. Xiao Bojian sent a messenger to pass the letter to you, but Fu Yan kept it instead. The sudden mention of the letter stunned Chu Lian for an instant. She wanted to cry out loud. What was going on? She hated Xiao Bojian so much that she never ever wanted to see him again, yet the events around her seemed to be connecting the two of them together no matter what. Wasn't this the plight of being the protagonist of the story? If He Changdi was even the slightest bit dumber, their relationship might really have been destroyed by this. Chu Lian looked up and met his shadowed gaze. He Sanlang, you believe me, don't you? He Changdi frowned deeply. What did you call me? The corners of Chu Lian's lips tugged into a pout. She turned her gaze away and refused to speak. He Changdi lifted her chin first before raising his upper body to lean over and plant a gentle kiss on her lips. He softened his tone and coaxed, what should you call me? Chu Lian couldn't understand how their open and frank conversation had somehow turned into a flirtatious scene. The two of them were just too close together now. Her exhales were blowing directly over his slightly exposed collarbones. Chu Lian couldn't help but flush in response to the situation. Call me hubby. He Changdi's low and magnetic voice resounded beside Chu Lian's ears, raising goosebumps all over Chu Lian's body. Since she was still trapped in the circle of He Changdi's arms, she could only give in. She bit her bottom lip before letting out a frustrated huff, hubby. A faint smile finally appeared on He Changdi's lips. He tugged with the arm around Chu Lian's waist, pulling Chu Lian into his embrace and enveloping her body with his own, forming a protective cage around her. It'll be better if you use a gentler tone next time. Chu Lian raised a brow. He Sanlang. You're still picking on my tone. He Changdi rested his chin on the top of Chu Lian's head. As low laughter rang out from above her, Chu Lian could feel the vibrations of his chest. Before she had the chance to enjoy the warm moment, his palm landed a sound smack on her pert bottom. You've already forgotten what I just taught you. The abrupt switch from their serious conversation into perverted flirting caught Chu Lian off guard. That one smack made her cover her bottom instinctively as she trembled with indignation. Her next reaction was to push He Changdi away and glare at him. He Changdi reached out to stroke her back as if soothing an alarmed kitten. Lianer, I believe you. Chu Lian took in a deep breath to gather all the fury rising within her and quickly bit down hard on his exposed collarbone. Afraid that she would hurt her teeth on his tough skin, He Changdi purposely relaxed his muscles and let her do as she liked. Chu Lian gnawed on He Sanlang's collarbone until all her anger had been spent. Despite her best efforts, all she managed to leave in the end was 2 faint rows of tiny tooth marks. She hadn't even drawn any blood and had instead made her jaw ache from all the effort. Chapter 530, How Couples Should Communicate. 5. Speechless at the toughness of his skin, Chu Lian stopped biting him and buried her head in his chest instead. The discontentment in her slowly faded away and the impulse that had filled her head dissipated. When she finally regained her calm, Chu Lian suddenly realized that He Changdi had derailed the conversation completely. She had been intending to have a serious discussion with him and make him realize his mistakes. How on earth had it turned into asking if he believed her about the letter and the jade amulet? Thinking back on it carefully, she wasn't the one at fault for the letter or the jade pendant. She was the innocent victim here. Once she had thought it through, Chu Lian quickly pushed He Sanlang away and glared at him with her clear, almond-shaped eyes. He Sanlang lowered his head to meet his wife eye to eye. Upon seeing her eyes clear without any of the anxiety and impatience from before, he realized that Chu Lian had realized what he just did. He looked away and said, "Ahem. Lianer, how I acted after we returned from Prince Weiss' estate was entirely my fault, I apologize." For the first time, He Sanlang had stopped trying to avoid the topic and had actually admitted to his mistake. Although his apology was rather vague, it was already a huge step forward that he had admitted fault to this degree, especially considering his awkward personality. Chu Lian knew that she shouldn't push him too hard for now. Rome hadn't been built in a day after all. Chu Lian believed that their understanding of each other would naturally deepen over time as long as they could live together harmoniously. By then, these mysterious problems wouldn't need to be resolved at all, as they wouldn't even exist. He Sanlang had never admitted to his mistakes in such a straightforward manner before. When he finished apologizing, his ears even turned red without his knowledge. Staring at his stiff expression, Chu Lian couldn't help bursting into a wide grin. She reached out with her fair fingers and touched He Sanlang's flushed ears. They were hot to the touch and were at a much higher temperature than the rest of his body. He Chang's earlobes had always been sensitive, so having it touched by his lover made him stiffen up. All of the surplus blood in his body gathered into a certain area. It took so much to get you to admit your mistake. Also, don't go around getting jealous for no reason. I don't have any relationship with Xiao Bojian at all. Chu Lian declared to He Sanlang in a serious tone. He Changdi wrapped both arms around her and pulled her into an even closer embrace. The rigid tension that had filled his body slowly drifted away from having her soft figure in his arms. He sulked a little as he said, "I know that I shouldn't be jealous, but I can't help it. The way Xiao Bojian looked at you didn't help that either." Chu Lian rolled her eyes. She was on the verge of suffocating from all this injustice being piled upon her. What could she even do about it if someone looked at her funny? Xiao Bojian wasn't some random commoner, so she couldn't just lash out at him in the open or dig out his eyes. He Sanlang's jealousy was completely unreasonable. He Sanlang's hand was caressing her petite back even as he continued sulking, "You're my wife. Anyway, other men aren't allowed to look at you in such a manner at all. Just you wait, I definitely won't let Xiao Bojian off." The corner of Chu Lian's lips twitched. She didn't feel like replying to He Chang's pointless proclamation. In any case, she didn't care about what happened to Xiao Bojian. If He Changdi really had the ability to drag Xiao Bojian down from his high horse, she would actually support her lunatic husband in doing so. Now that they had resolved all the misunderstandings between them, the couple had naturally become closer as a result. Chu Lian frowned and declared fiercely, "He Changdi, you're not allowed to brood so much on your thoughts in the future. I can't always guess your meaning. If you're feeling uneasy, you have to let me know." Chapter 531, How Couples Should Communicate, 6. He Changdi reached out and caught hold of Chu Lian's delicate chin, lifting her head upwards to make her meet his chilly and serene gaze. Chu Lian noticed the tinge of dissatisfaction in his eyes and made a moue of frustration. She repeated the words she had said earlier, but this time, she addressed him as hubby instead. Finally, the tsundere He Sanlang was satisfied. He made an affirmative grunt in response and followed up by moving to kiss her soft cherry lips. His tongue pushed its way past her teeth and toyed with the sweet softness inside. Chu Lian hadn't expected things to develop in this direction. She froze up at first, but she quickly melted into his tender and gentle kiss. She felt as if she had turned into a puddle of water and was going to fuse into his warm, broad chest. He Changdi couldn't stop his hand from roaming up and down her soft, supple back, as if he were inspecting his territory. At this point, Chu Lian's mind was turning fuzzy. Her skin was suddenly heating up, as if she was getting scalded by his touch. Her rational mind gradually faded away and she couldn't help releasing a moan. Her body rubbed against his chest subconsciously. Si Hangdi had been holding back with everything he had from the start, but when Chu Lian let loose such an enticing sound, the floodgates burst open. In an instant, his reason was blown to smithereens. His hand headed up Chu Lian's back and fiddled around for a few seconds, causing her dress to slide away from her chest. He immediately pounced upon the two soft peaches and toyed with them like a tyrant. Chu Lian panted for breath. She was feeling feverish all over, but there was still a shred of rationality left in her which found this strange. She didn't understand why her inhibitions had suddenly disappeared. With just that small motion from Changdi, she had been unable to stop herself from rubbing herself against him. There seemed to be a strange energy in her body spurring her on to follow her instincts. When they got to the point when their clothes were in disarray and they were about to lose control, Changdi suddenly pushed Chu Lian away. There was a terrifying darkness in his eyes and his breath sounded uncontrollably hoarse. He placed his arms on Chu Lian's feeble shoulders and put some distance between them. He looked down. He didn't dare to look at the alluring sight that Chu Lian was right now. He forcefully calmed his breathing, reached to his side, and put his own large cloak on Chu Lian, completely covering up her exposed skin. His hands turned into fists and he quickly got up. Before leaving, he announced, "I'm going to the bathroom." He then made a hasty escape from the study as if a monster was chasing at his heels. Chu Lian watched dazedly as he cut a sorry figure in his departure. When the scorching feeling in her body receded, her wits finally returned to her. A furious blush bloomed on her face after the return of her rationality. She punched at the chaise with her fists and bit her bottom lip. What had happened to her just now? Why had she started rubbing against Changdi? And why had she acted so wanton? Could it be that she lacked self-control? Could it be that it was just this easy for Changdi to seduce her? More importantly, Changdi had actually rejected her. How embarrassing. Chu Lian wanted to bury herself in a hole somewhere. However, when she thought back to Changdi's reaction, she found it strange. He was already in that state, so he obviously wanted it. Why did he end up pushing her away at the last minute? The more Chu Lian wondered, the darker her expression became. She wasn't just angry at herself for being so easily seduced, she was also angry because of Changdi's abnormal rejection. Taking in a deep breath, the red-faced Chu Lian took off the dark cloak that Changdi had put on her. When she looked down at herself, her face heated up uncontrollably. There were red marks all over her fair chest, including a long chain of them on her collarbones. She frantically pulled the skirt of her dress back up, before adding on a vest. Once she had covered herself up properly, she finally gathered the courage to leave the room to get a change of clothes. Chapter 532, Nourishing Soup, 1. With so many hickeys on her neck, she couldn't continue wearing this slightly revealing dress. While she was changing clothes, Chu Lian could hear the sounds of Sanlang taking a bath in the bathroom. She pouted and cursed him under her breath. When she was done sorting out her appearance, she returned to the study to do some work. Once Chu Lian had left and Sanlang couldn't hear any more sounds coming from the bedroom, he was finally able to move freely without the fear of being heard. Some time later, a small piece of fabric fell out of Sanlang's hand, which had been draped over the edge of the bathtub. If Chu Lian had been there to see the soft light-colored piece of fabric, she would have immediately identified it as her breast band. Changdi took a deep sigh and leaned back against the wall of the bathtub, basking in the afterglow while calming down. He smiled bitterly, feeling as if his actions were like shooting himself in the foot. When he got out of the bathtub, Changdi picked up the small piece of fabric and put it together with his dirty clothes. He rubbed his nose a little awkwardly, before putting on clean clothes and leaving the bathroom. He Changdi and Chu Lian had lunch together at noon. Chu Lian had the habit of taking afternoon naps, so she went to sleep an hour after lunch. He Changdi was tempted to take a nap with his wife, but when he recalled what had happened in the study, he gritted his teeth and went to his study to work. Chu Lian couldn't be bothered with him. She had been craving sleep more for the past 2 days, perhaps due to the nourishing soup that senior servant Zhong had given her. It might also have been due to the arrival of spring, and she was having trouble adjusting to the changing seasons. In any case, Chu Lian fell asleep soon after getting into bed. Senior servant Gue lifted the drapes to take a peek, before stealthily leaving the room. Happiness was shining from senior servant Gui's eyes. She bumped into Xian at the side room and couldn't help saying, "Third young madam has suddenly been sleeping so much, could it be?" Although Xian was a young maiden herself, she had been educated about various things by senior servants Zhong and Gue for the sake of serving Chu Lian as a handmaid. Therefore, she was aware of many details regarding matters after marriage. Hearing that, she smiled and answered, "Momo, you're overthinking things. How could anything happen this quickly? Third young madam has only just consummated her marriage. Perhaps she's feeling easily tired now that it's spring because she overexerted herself at the northern border." Ziyan's suggestion caused the smile to fade from senior servant Gui's face. "That won't do. You'll have to ask Great Dr. Miao to take a look at third young madam tomorrow." Xian smiled. Senior servant Gue was worrying too much. "Have you forgotten? Third young master recently asked Great Dr. Miao to take third young madam's pulse, and third young madam has been drinking nourishing soup daily." After getting reminded of the situation, senior servant Gue shook her head helplessly. She couldn't resist adding on, "I really hope third young madam can get pregnant soon, so she can get a foothold in the estate." Xian sighed in response. Didn't they all? The customs in the Great Wu dynasty were more open than the previous dynasty, so even young ladies who hadn't come of age could participate in banquets and visit their friends. However, the rules were still more strict on women, especially after marriage. If a wife didn't manage to produce any heirs, it was as good as committing a crime. This could be seen from what had happened to the first branch. If Madame Zhou had birthed a son, her relationship with He Daolong would never have deteriorated to its current state. It had been at least half a year since third young madam and third young master had gotten married. Although they knew that the two had only consummated their marriage a few days ago, no one else did. If people started gossiping about it, third young madam would be the one who received the blame. When a wife couldn't produce any heirs, the blame was always directed at the woman. Chapter 533, Nourishing Soup. 2. Chu Lian slept extremely well. Other than feeling slightly warmer than usual, she felt great when she woke up from her nap. She was helped by Xian to the bathroom to wipe down her body. After changing into a loose and comfortable home dress, she returned to her bedroom. She immediately noticed the small porcelain bowl on the table and let out an anguished wail, "I still have to drink that." Wenlan covered her mouth to hide her grin, while senior servant Zhong explained, "Third young madam, this nourishing soup only takes effect after drinking it long term. Great Dr. Miao said that you'll have to drink it every day for half a month. It's only been 4 days. Chu Lian." Although the nourishing soup wasn't hard to swallow and even had a nice aroma, she was still sick of it after drinking it daily. Furthermore, she drank it more than once every day. Under the watchful eyes of senior servant Zhong and the other servants, Chu Lian had no choice but to gulp down the soup with an unwilling expression. She didn't know if she was just imagining things, but she started feeling uncomfortably hot inside after drinking the soup. She tolerated it for a while, but eventually she couldn't continue enduring the uncomfortable feeling, so she asked Xian, "Cut a pear for me, I'm feeling a little thirsty." Now that it was February, the only fruit available in the capital was pear. Apples hadn't been discovered yet in the Great Wu dynasty, so there was no point in asking for those. As for tangerines, they hadn't been in season for a while now. The pears available now had been specially preserved from last year's harvest using a special method, so they were rather expensive too. Most commoners wouldn't be able to afford them at all. Thinking about this, Chu Lian kind of missed the modern times where she could eat practically all kinds of fruit during winter. When fruits returned to the market this year, she was going to think of ways to turn them into canned fruits or candied fruits. Xian revealed a troubled expression, while senior servant Zhong secretly shook her head at Xian. Chu Lian noticed that Xian hadn't moved to get her a pear, so she looked at her in confusion. Why aren't you going? Could it be that there's no more pears in the estate? Since Chu Lian had come up with a plausible explanation herself, Xian quickly nodded and agreed. That's right, third young madam. The remaining few have been sent to Countess Jingan. Chu Lian could only sigh in response. She had them move the braziers out of the room, before she changed into a thinner robe. After making these changes, she was finally feeling more comfortable. Senior servant Zhong took the excuse of sending some tea to meet with Yi Changdi in the study and make a report. He Sanlang was seated behind the desk with a pile of official documents that he had just completed. His expression was grim and he was obviously in a horrendous mood at this time. What did you say? Grandmother demanded Gillen restaurant back. Senior servant Zhong nodded. Third young madam has already returned the deed to the matriarch. A shadow covered He Sanlang's gaze. He stared into blank space, but there was no telling what he was thinking about. Senior servant Zhong stood to one side quietly as she didn't dare to disturb him. With how still she was, she looked just like a statue. After some time had passed, Yi Changdi's deep, magnetic voice resounded. I'll take note of this matter. Is there anything else, Momo? Senior servant Zhong hesitated for a moment, before speaking up a little awkwardly. Third young master, Great Dr. Miao instructed that third young madam must not participate in any bedroom activities within 7 days of taking the nourishing soup. He Changdi. Even though he was a man, it was still uncomfortable for him when senior servant Zhong was so blunt about it. Great Dr. Miao had already made this clear to him before, yet senior servant Zhong was reminding him about it again. Was he someone who seemed to be lacking in restraint? He Changdi coughed to conceal his awkwardness. Don't worry, Momo. I am aware. Senior servant Zhong sighed in relief inside upon hearing his answer. She had been afraid that the youthful third young master would be unable to suppress his desires. However, third young master had always been a calm and collected person who followed through with his promises. If he said so, he would definitely do it. Besides, this concerned third young madam's health, so he wouldn't be careless. After making these things clear, senior servant Zhong quickly left. When evening fell, He Changdi finally left the study and returned to the parlor. He then asked after Chu Lian's whereabouts. Wenlan replied, third young madam went to visit the countess over an hour ago. He Sanlang thought about it for a moment, before heading off to his mother's courtyard himself. The moment he entered the parlor, he was met with the sight of Chu Lian happily picking up a small slice of snow pear with a toothpick and putting it into her mouth. Chapter 534, Health is Important. 1. He Sanlang's face instantly turned black. He first swept his icy gaze over to Xian, who was standing beside Chu Lian. Xian's whole body froze as a troubled expression appeared on her face. Following that, He Sanlang strode towards Countess Jingan and bowed in greeting. Sanlang, you've come too. Come sit beside mother. Countess Jingan was clearly happy that her youngest son had come to visit her. He Changdi quickly sat down beside his mother. Once seated, he extended his long arm and took away the plate of pear slices on the table beside Chu Lian. When the toothpick that Chu Lian was holding landed on thin air, she looked at him in astonishment. What was wrong with He Changdi? She couldn't even eat a few pieces of pear now. Countess Jingan was also finding it strange. What's wrong? Since Lianer likes to eat pears, why not let her have a few more pieces? I haven't been eating them much, so it's a waste to leave them lying around here anyway. Have the maidservants take some back with you later. Mother has too many pears to finish. The first half of her words was directed at He Sanlang and the latter half was directed towards Chu Lian. Before Chu Lian could happily agree and thank her mother-in-law, He Changdi had already rejected the offer. No need. Mother, you should keep the pears and eat them yourself. If you can't finish them all, then give them to the servants. Chu Lian hadn't been expecting He Sanlang to say that, so she secretly gave him a glare. However, He Changdi was seemingly ignorant of the complaint in her eyes. He continued to speak to his mother. Pears are cold by nature. Lianer is susceptible to the cold, so it wouldn't be good for her health if she eats too much. Countess Jingan initially wanted to put in a good word or two for Chu Lian, but she held her tongue when she saw that her son was doing it for the sake of his wife's health. Instead, she turned to comfort Chu Lian. Lianer, Sanlang is right. We have to take good care of our own health. It's better to eat fewer of these cold fruits. It's still chilly outside now, so you should make sure to keep your body warm. Countess Jingan had been bedridden for many years and had been drinking different medicines during that whole time. She had become half a doctor after going through a prolonged period of illness. During the long suffering, she had also learned plenty of methods to maintain good health. Once she started on the topic, she couldn't stop talking. Chu Lian couldn't interrupt her since the countess was her elder. All she could do was to listen earnestly and put on an enlightened expression, while suffering in her heart. Now that the root of Countess Jingan's illness was gone, her health had improved by leaps and bounds. She had also become more livelier than before. With her newfound energy, she actually managed to talk about the subject of health for an hour. When the Countess finally realized what she had done, she felt embarrassed for a moment. However, since it was only her son and daughter-in-law before her, the moment of embarrassment faded away quickly. She was happy for the young couple instead, as she saw the genuine concern in the gaze that her son directed at his wife. All right, I hope you don't find me too naggy. But you must pay attention to your health no matter how busy you are. Lianer, as a woman, it's especially important for you to take good care of your body. That's all from me today. It's getting late now. I won't keep you two for dinner, so go back to eat by yourselves. Countess Jingan could also see the suffering expressions on the young couple's faces from her long lecture, so she waved her hand to dismiss them. Even He Sanlang hadn't been able to withstand his mother's endless nagging. He breathed a sigh of relief after leaving the courtyard while holding Chu Lian's hand. Chapter 535, Health is Important. 2. Chu Lian had only managed to eat half a plate of snow pears at her mother-in-law's. Her craving hadn't been satisfied and she wanted to eat more. She didn't think that He Changdi would start minding what she ate, so she wasn't very happy. He Changdi, I want to eat pears. Chu Lian complained to him directly. They had made an agreement today that they would tell each other everything and that they wouldn't have cold wars or sulk by themselves. He Sanlang wanted to laugh when he heard the rare childish tone from Chu Lian. He whispered, "Do you think I'm just playing with you? You can't eat cold-natured fruit right now. I'll explain it to you when we get back." "Aw." Chu Lian was slightly baffled. What was going on? Why were fruits suddenly forbidden? She had even ate ice cream during winter back in modern times and nothing had happened to her health. When he finished speaking, He Changdi quickly dragged Chu Lian back to Songtao Court. It was already dinner time. Senior servant Zhong had already received the report that the young couple was on their way back, so she began to instruct the maidservants to prepare dinner. By the time Chu Lian and He Changdi arrived, there was already a table full of food in the parlor. When Chu Lian looked over all the foods on the table, she couldn't drum up any of her appetite. She was feeling stuffy and uncomfortable since He Changdi had pulled her into a brisk walk back from Countess Jean Gan's courtyard. She wanted to eat something cold right now, but everything on the table was steaming with heat. She really didn't have any appetite. However, He Changdi had pulled her down to sit at the table. Chu Lian sighed, then turned her head to instruct Bai Cha, "Bring me a cup of tea first." Bai Cha was surprised. "Third young madam, do you mean Sin Cha?" Chu Lian nodded in affirmation. Bai Cha thought it was strange and glanced in askance at Xian. Didn't third young madam dislike Sin Cha? Didn't she normally only drink honey water or honeydew juice? Bai Cha was stopped by He Changdi's icy gaze right when she was about to go prepare the Sin Cha. Chu Lian noticed that Bai Cha wasn't moving. When she traced the cause back to He Changdi, she exclaimed in astonishment, "He Changdi, do you have a problem? You're not even going to let me drink some tea." He Sanlang's face darkened after being reprimanded by his wife. He waved his hand to order the attending servants to leave. A moment later, they were the only ones left in the parlor. He Changdi sat beside Chu Lian in the quiet and empty parlor. Since there wasn't anyone else in the parlor, he tugged Chu Lian onto his lap with an easy wave of his arm. With Chu Lian's petite figure, trying to resist He Sanlang was like an ant trying to move a tree. She struggled a little to no avail, so she gave up. Seeing that she was still trying to resist at this time, He Sanlang reached towards the softness of her chest and squeezed it. He lowered his voice and scolded her, "Are you going to behave?" She didn't know if it was something to do with the tonic that she had drunk, but Chu Lian's whole body felt like it was on fire when he casually teased her. She stiffened up, not daring to move again. She gritted her teeth and smacked He Sanlang's hand away. She replied with rising anger, "He Changdi, if you don't give me an explanation now, then don't expect to stop me from eating pears." He Changdi didn't know how he should react. She usually acted so clever, but she was actually just a glutton. She couldn't be kept from any of her cravings at all. He Sanlang put some strength into his arms and cuddled Chu Lian. He let out a light sigh and asked, "I believe the maidservants have already told you about the situation with your body, right? My boat is slightly cold." He Changdi nodded. "The nourishing tonic that you're drinking twice a day was decided upon after much deliberation from Great Dr. Miao and Senior Servant Zhong. It contains some special medicinal herbs that will help to supplement the warmth of your body, but you have to avoid cold-natured foods. While you're drinking this tonic, you're not allowed to eat anything cold." He Sanlang patiently explained to her. Chu Lian instantly wailed when she heard his words. She knew that it was difficult to balance the inner systems of a body. Great Dr. Miao was already being nice by not prescribing her those really bitter medicines. But drinking this nourishing soup was also suffering for her. The corners of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. "How long do I have to drink this tonic for?" Chapter 536, Bamboo Green, 1. He Sanlang looked downwards and examined the displeased expression on her face. He littered kisses over her smooth and tender cheeks to soothe her. 7 days. You can change to a different tonic after 7 days and you won't have to so strict about avoiding certain foods by then. You'll be able to eat fruits and drink tea then, but not too much. Chu Lian shook her head helplessly when she heard He Changdi's reply. At least it was only 7 days. If it was 1 or 2 months, then she would probably from the suffering. Chu Lian pursed her lips. All she could do was to accept this reality. She tried to pry open He Changdi's hold around her waist. "Let me go, I want to eat my dinner." He Sanlang smiled and loosened his arms. Chu Lian promptly got off his lap and sat beside him. To be honest, Chu Lian wasn't the only one blushing and feeling embarrassed when they were sitting together so intimately. He Changdi couldn't endure it for much longer either, so it was better for them to sit separately. Chu Lian still didn't have much appetite. She only ate some of the mild-flavored dishes before setting down her chopsticks. When He Changdi noticed that she wasn't eating a lot, his brows creased together. He personally ladled a bowl of chicken soup and placed it in front of her. "You're eating too little." Chu Lian didn't want to waste his good intentions, so she took up a spoon and slowly drank the soup one sip at a time. She suddenly recalled something she had been wanting to ask, so she turned her head towards He Changdi, who was focused on his food. "He Sanlang, where did you get all the money to buy those accessories for me?" Those accessories cost at least 4,000 to 5,000 taels, which was a rather large sum of money. He Changdi's hand hovered in the air for a moment, jade chopstick still in his grasp. His deep gaze turned towards her. The corner of her lips twitched slightly in a guilty manner and she added a sweet call of husband. He Changdi's discontentment was finally suppressed after he heard that. The young couple hadn't been together for long. Chu Lian was unable to step into the role of a wife and naturally address He Changdi as husband so quickly, unlike the noble ladies who had been born and raised in this era. She still needed some time to completely adapt to it. He Sanlang set down the chopsticks in his hand and looked at Chu Lian seriously. He pondered for a moment before speaking. "Lianer, I don't want to lie to you. I can't tell you where I got the money from right now. But you don't have to worry. All of it belongs to me rightfully and I didn't use any illegal means to obtain that money." Chu Lian didn't expect to receive such a reply. She was slightly shocked, but she didn't push him for more answers. She had read the original novel, so she knew the general direction that the Great Wu dynasty would move towards in the future. She didn't want to bother with the politics in court and she didn't have any wild ambitions. As long as she could have a comfortable life with enough money to spend, she didn't want to interfere with irrelevant matters. Moreover, there were certain things that she couldn't change by herself no matter how much she tried. Her only wish was to live leisurely and laze around. As long as others didn't provoke her first, she would keep to her place. When the time came, all she had to do was to make sure that the He family was moving in the right direction and that their future would be guaranteed. "All right, I won't ask any more. Even if it's your money, you shouldn't spend it so recklessly. If grandmother and the others find out, they might misunderstand." Wasn't it so? House Jingon was severely lacking in money right now. They had even been thick-skinned enough to ask her to return Gillen restaurant. If matriarchy ever found out that He Changdi had spent a few thousand taels to buy accessories for her, then she would definitely be mad at the third branch. The He family haven't split off yet and they still lived with their elders. Thus, they had to do everything in a more low-key manner. He Sanlang understood his wife's misgivings and concerns. He reached over and stroked Chu Lian's hair. "Don't worry. Grandmother won't find out. Don't tell me that I still have to ask for permission from others before buying some jewelry for my wife." Chu Lian rolled her eyes. He hadn't just bought some jewelry. He had brought back almost all the accessories on display at Treasure Pavilion. "Eat some more." He Changdi added more food to her bowl. Seated as she was beside He Changdi, when she watched him eating in such a serious manner, she unconsciously followed along and ate more than she expected. She noticed that He Sanlang wouldn't waste any food no matter his circumstances. The couple's meals usually consisted of 3 dishes and 1 soup, a typical amount served in most noble households. However, Chu Lian had improved the menu slightly and their meals tasted better than most. The amount served on the table was also just enough for the couple, so there wouldn't be much left over. 2 days later, the day of Chu Yuan's coming-of-age ceremony had arrived. Chu Lian had already received the invitation beforehand. Furthermore, it concerned her maiden family, so she couldn't just skip the event. He Changdi had to go to the Ministry of War today to take over his duties, so he wouldn't be free until noon. After the young couple had woken up this morning, senior servant Gui and Xian came to help Chu Lian pick out a dress to wear to go out today. Chu Lian found it strange that He Changdi was still around when she came out of the bathroom. She asked, "Don't you have to go to the Ministry of War today? Why haven't you left yet?" He Changdi glanced at the casually dressed Chu Lian. "I'm not in a hurry. I'll go over to the Ministry of War after escorting you to the estate." Chu Lian was slightly surprised. "Won't that delay your official business?" As Chu Lian was speaking to He Changdi, she sat in front of the vanity table and let Wen Lan style her hair. Chapter 537, Bamboo Green, 2. He Changdi leaned against the wooden lounge chair beside the window. Today, he was dressed in a bamboo green-colored robe with a slightly darker cloak. His jade-embellished belt was secured with a high-quality black jade piece in the shape of a tortoise. A jade crown kept his high bun in place. Although he had a cold aura, he looked every bit a handsome gentleman. Just by lounging on the wooden chair in a relaxed pose, he was like a living painting, enticing the viewer into infatuation. He Changdi was already prepared to leave and was just waiting for his wife to be done. Since he didn't have anything to do, he picked up one of the storybooks that Chu Lian usually read that was placed on the table beside him and casually flipped through the pages. Chu Lian was in the peak of her life now. Her skin was smooth and fair, so she didn't even need to put on any makeup. After combing her hair, she picked out a phoenix hairpin with emerald inlays and a sapphire headdress. She filled in her eyebrows lightly and finished up by putting some rouge on her lips. Though He Changdi appeared to be reading the storybook in his hand, he hadn't flipped the page for a whole 15 minutes. While Bai Cha was serving him some tea, she hid her smile when she noticed that third young master was occasionally glancing in third young madam's direction. Third young madam had turned 16 this year. Her facial features had matured compared to when she had just gotten married last year, and the baby fat on her cheeks had completely faded. She looked absolutely stunning now. Her natural beauty still shone no matter how many times they looked at her. Even a maidservant like her was smitten by third young madam's looks, let alone third young master. At this time, senior servant Gui walked out from behind the screen with 2 dresses in hand. "Third young madam, which one would you like?" The 2 dresses that senior servant Gui had picked out were begonic-colored and bamboo green-colored respectively. Both dresses were presents from Princess Wei which Chu Lian hadn't worn yet. Chu Lian was about to pick the begonic-colored dress when He Changdi pointed at the bamboo green-colored one instead, "That one." Senior servant Gui was a little conflicted from the command, and she glanced at Chu Lian, asking for her opinion with her eyes. Chu Lian nodded. Both sets of clothing were skillfully tailored and made of high-quality fabrics. Since they had been sent over by Princess Wei, there was no way that they would be of bad quality. Although the designs on them were slightly different, it didn't matter much for Chu Lian. She wasn't picky about her dressing, so senior servant Gui was usually the one who took care of her wardrobe. Senior servant Gui instructed a maidservant to put the begonic-colored dress back in the closet and handed the bamboo green-colored dress to Xian. It was only after Chu Lian finished changing and glanced at He Changdi that she finally came to a realization. They were actually wearing the same color today. If they stood together, then it looked like they had purposely worn matching outfits. Chu Lian smiled inwardly when she recalled He Changdi interrupting and picking out a dress for her just now. Senior servant Gui and the maidservants in the room came to the same realization when they saw their masters standing together. When He Changdi saw that she was about ready, he set the storybook aside. He didn't forget to help Chu Lian into an auburn cloak before stepping out the door. 30 minutes later, the couple arrived at the estate. Since Miss Yuan was a legitimate daughter of the second branch, the estate was throwing a large and lively party for her coming-of-age ceremony today. Chu Lian's carriage stopped in front of the main gate. There were already senior servants and maidservants waiting for the guests in front of the main entrance. He Changdi got off the carriage first, before turning around and offering his hand to help Chu Lian off the carriage. The senior servants greeting the guests at the main entrance were all sharp-eyed, so they were able to recognize Chu Lian with a single look. A senior servant ran over hastily with a maidservant following behind. Sixth Miss is finally back. The old master and old madam have always been mentioning how they've missed you very much. They then bobbed in greeting towards He Changdi, who was standing beside Chu Lian. The senior servant's gaze darted all over the couple. When she noticed the matching attire on Chu Lian and He Changdi, as well as how attentive He Changdi was to Chu Lian, she became even more careful in her interactions with them. Sixth young master, the old master, eldest master, second master, third master, as well as the young masters are all in the study of the outer court. This old servant will send someone to guide you over. The servants of Ing estate had become even more humble in front of He Changdi, thanks to his newly bestowed title of Marquis. Chu Lian turned towards him in question, "Do you want to enter and have a seat first?" He Changdi shook his head, "No, you should go ahead. I have to go to the Ministry of War. I'll come back around noon." Chu Lian nodded in acknowledgement. He Sanlang took the reins that Lai Yue offered to him with one hand and grasped Chu Lian's hand lightly with the other. He also shot Wenqing and Wenlon a meaning look before mounting his horse and quickly leaving. The senior servant could see how much He Changdi cherished Chu Lian. Even though he had official business at hand, he had still personally escorted Chu Lian back to her maiden home. It was clear as day that Sixth Miss held an important position in Sixth Young Master's heart. Thus, the senior servant didn't dare to slight her. She cautiously invited Chu Lian into the estate. Just as Chu Lian entered the Ing estate and passed the screen at the entrance, a maidservant hidden in the shade hastily ran towards the inner court. Anxiang Court. This had been Chu Lian's courtyard when she lived in the Ing estate, but it belonged to Miss Yuan now. Miss Yuan was currently in the middle of dressing up in her bedroom. She was the main character today, and it was the very important day when she would finally come of age. Second Madam had been afraid that she would make a mistake, so she had sent her trusted senior servant over. Miss Yuan was currently sitting in front of the vanity table as her nursemaid combed her hair. A maidservant suddenly ran over in a flustered manner. She almost bumped into the handmaid Xiaoqin, who was holding a tray. Xiaoqin berated her furiously before asking, "What's going on? Why are you in such a hurry?" The maidservant peeked into the room at 8th Miss, who was still getting ready, before she cautiously glanced back at Xiaoqin. "Sister Xiaoqin, 6th Miss is back." Miss Yuan had heard the noise coming from outside, so she ordered the maidservant to enter the bedroom and report. The maidservant anxiously entered the bedroom with her head lowered. Miss Yuan lifted her hand to stop the nursemaid combing her hair. She turned her head towards the maidservant. "Tell me exactly what happened when Sixth Sister stepped into the estate." Chapter 538, Meeting Miss Su. 1. The maidservant recounted all the details regarding Chu Lian's arrival upon 8th Miss' request. Her narration was so detailed that she even reported that Chu Lian and He Changdi had worn the same color. The maidservant's report stirred up the hornet's nest in Miss Yuan's heart. The one thing she couldn't stand the most was to see Chu Lian living better than she was. In the past, she had always been able to come out above Chu Lian in the Ing estate. She had also caused Chu Lian to suffer much in secret. However, the gap between them seemed to have widened incredibly fast after Chu Lian had gotten married. Chu Lian had the extremely profitable Gillen restaurant in her pockets, yet she still had to ask for her parents' permission to buy an accessory. It wasn't even a given that they would give their approval either. Although Chu Lian was already married, Brother Xiao was still thinking about her. He couldn't forget her. Even her husband's family was superior to Hao Xing. Her husband had gained merit at the northern border and had been bestowed the title of Marquis on Yuan. They were clearly both daughters of the second branch, but Chu Lian had already become a marchioness without any notice while she remained a nobody. Miss Yuan couldn't accept this massive gap between them. They had come from the same roots, so how could Chu Lian be doing so much better than her? Even Prince Wei's estate held her in high esteem. She had invited Chu Lian over today with the intention to humiliate her. There was a huge difference between their coming-of-age ceremonies after all. Upon seeing the grandeur of her ceremony, Chu Lian would definitely recall how her own had been so plain and half-hearted. Even so, Miss Yuan was still unsatisfied in her heart. He Changdi had official business to take care of, yet had still personally escorted Chu Lian to the Ying estate. Wasn't Chu Lian trying to show off her position in House Jinggan and He Sanlang's current merits? Miss Yuan wrung the handkerchief in her hand with a wretched expression on her face. Her heart was filled with resentment. The only advantage that Chu Lian had over her was her looks alone. Xiaoqi noticed the grim expression on 8th Miss and how she was silently biting her lips, obviously deep in her thoughts. She waved her hand to signal the reporting maidservant to retreat. 8th Miss. Xiaoqi probed with a call. Miss Yuan came back to her senses and took in a deep breath to suppress the monstrous jealousy within her heart. Chu Yuan sent a look at Xiaoqi, who immediately understood what she wanted. The handmaid stealthily left the courtyard while no one was paying attention. Chu Yuan stared at her reflection in the mirror. A corner of her lips curved upwards, forming a sinister smile on her young face. Chu Lian, so you think you're living better than me? It'll destroy your reputation and completely ruin you. He Sanlang was known to be an upright and honest man who was also crazily devoted to his wife. She really wanted to know if he would still want Chu Lian once he sees what she's really like. Chu Lian was invited into the inner court by one of the old madam's handmaids. All the womenfolk of the Ying estate were currently there. When Chu Lian had been a young miss of Hao Xing, she had rarely met the old madam. Yet the old madam was currently holding Chu Lian's hand and asking about her life in a warm and caring manner. The aunts from the other branches who had looked down on House Ying's 6th miss in the past were also acting thoughtful and attentive towards her now. She had already married into the Jinggan household for more than half a year. The question that these two-faced relatives asked the most was whether there had been any news from her belly. Amongst them, a particular aunt-in-law's words were the most unpleasant to hear. The women of our Chu family are all very fertile. Miss Lian, take a look at how your married sisters have fared. All of them have given birth to sons, so you mustn't bring shame to our Chu family. While it sounded as if she was urging Chu Lian to become pregnant as quickly as possible, it was actually a sarcastic remark about Chu Lian having been able to marry into the Jinggan estate due to this absurd stereotype. Furthermore, she had only managed to turn her life around all thanks to that enviable windfall. In addition, she was also mocking her for not being pregnant yet. This group of women were definitely mad with jealousy over Chu Lian's current status, so it was inevitable that they would say such unpleasant words. However, they only dared to do so because Chu Lian's position wasn't high enough. If Chu Lian's status reached a certain level, then these women wouldn't dare to speak up at all. A good example would be the eldest Princess Royal of the previous dynasty, the sister to the Emperor, Princess Royal Chaoyang. Though she had never borne any children in her lifetime, she was considered a heroine. She led 100,000 elite soldiers to defend against the rebellion of Prince Huaiyan and protected the position of the imperial family. Chaoyang was then bestowed the title of Protector Princess Royal. Princess Royal Chaoyang and her husband, Princess Consort Chu, never had any children throughout their lives, but the Chu family had never dared to have any complaints. Matriarch Chu had even advised her son not to take any concubines. Although the people now were uncertain about whether Princess Consort Chu and Princess Royal Chaoyang truly loved each other, it remained a fact that Princess Consort Chu had never taken a concubine despite Princess Chaoyang being barren. That was enough to prove his love for her. Chu Lian sat beside the old madam with a faint smile. She didn't deign to reply to the rude aunt-in-law's words. The old madam held her hand with a kind expression on her face. "Miss Lian, your aunt's words may be somewhat unpleasant, but they're true. You've been married to Marquis An Yuan for nearly half a year. Why hasn't there been any news? This isn't good." Chu Lian hadn't thought that the entire housing would be eyeing her stomach. She was only 16 right now, so it would still be considered too early for her to get pregnant even by normal means. Her third aunt-in-law, seated further down on the right side, seemed to have thought of something. Her eyes turned from side to side suspiciously, before she smiled at Chu Lian and said, "Miss Lian, our Miss Fu is turning 14 this year. Her coming-of-age ceremony will be held the very next year. You should also know that your third aunt-in-law is very fertile. Miss Fu has 3 older brothers. If there's still no news from your belly a few months later, it wouldn't be good to let things drag on." There was a small garden just up in front. Everyone was gathered in the outer court right now, so there were barely any servants around in the inner court. It was quiet and serene in the garden, so it was a good place for a private chat. Miss Su sent a signal to the handmaid behind her with her eyes. The handmaid immediately bobbed in acknowledgement and retreated several steps, keeping a good distance from Miss Su and Chu Lian. Chu Lian could understand Miss Su's intention, so she waved at Wenqing and Wenlan to do the same. Chapter 540, Sixth Sister, Be Careful. 1. The cousins walked together along the garden path. When Miss Su saw that there was no one else around them, she clasped Chu Lian's hand and whispered, "Sixth sister, you have to be careful today in the estate. You can't trust anyone's words. Be extra cautious even during the banquet. It's best if you can avoid drinking any wine." Chu Lian was stunned by Miss Su's words. "Fifth sister, do you mean that someone is trying to trap me?" Miss Su hesitated for a moment before nodding. The gears in Chu Lian's head turned quickly. There were only a few people within the entire estate who had enough resentment and benefits at stake to do so. Her stepmother, second madam, and the one who hated her, Miss Yuan. Chu Lian sneered, "It wouldn't happen to be the 2 people that I'm thinking of, right?" Miss Su's expression turned grim. She shook her head and revealed 2 words, "Not only." For some reason, Miss Su felt that Chu Lian had become much more likable after she had gotten married, as compared to when she had been a young miss in the Ying estate. Could it be that a person's personality would be affected by a change of environment? Miss Su quickly got rid of the foolish thoughts in her heart. Her expression turned grave as she stared at Chu Lian. Even though she had come prepared, Chu Lian's eyes widened in surprise after she heard this unexpected answer. "That's why I'm telling you to be careful," Miss Su patted her hand. Chu Lian slowly hid the shock in her eyes and started making plans in her heart. She recalled her encounter with Chu Qijing in the middle of the road that day and the special invitation that he had extended to her at the end. Could it be that her father had a part to play in this? Chu Lian raised her head and looked towards Miss Su. "Fifth sister, thank you for the warning." Miss Yuan smiled indifferently, "It's nothing. I just happened to stumble upon this news inadvertently. Since you happened to come over today, it was a simple matter to give you a quick warning." Chu Lian didn't say anything else. They couldn't stay in the garden for too long because the coming-of-age ceremony was about to begin. Second Master and Second Madam had put in a lot of effort for Chu Yuan's coming-of-age ceremony. They had even invited several esteemed noblewomen to keep up with appearances. Miss Yuan's coming-of-age ceremony was a grand event. The married daughters of the Chu family in attendance were wringing their handkerchiefs in jealousy. Chu Yuan was so proud that she couldn't even conceal the smugness in her expression. Miss Yuan had purposely glanced over at Chu Lian as she was walking up the ceremonial stage. It was clear from her gaze that she was trying to flaunt her status and provoke Chu Lian. There was a banquet right after the coming-of-age ceremony ended. Chu Lian was assigned to sit next to the main table. Chapter 541, Sixth Sister, Be Careful, 2. Halfway through the meal, Chu Lian turned around to ask Wenqing, "Has third young master arrived yet?" Wenqing whispered into Chu Lian's ears, replying to "Third young madam, the driver of our carriage, Uncle Lu, sent someone to relay a message. He said that third young master is being delayed by some matters, so he'll come by a little later." Chu Lian nodded and turned back around without asking more. The older cousin beside her had been trying to eavesdrop with her ears pricked, so her whispers to Wenqing had been overheard. The round-faced and slightly chubby cousin raised one brow. "Sixth sister, you're already missing Marquis An Yuan when you've only just come back to your maiden home. What a loving couple, you really make us all envious." A furrow developed between Chu Lian's brows. There was an obvious trace of jealousy and dissatisfaction within this unfamiliar cousin's words. Even Wenqing and Wenlan couldn't help but frown when they heard her words. Right when Chu Lian was being distracted by this older cousin, someone bumped into her, causing her to lose her balance. Almost at the same time, she felt something hot on her shoulder. Teacups fell to the floor with a clatter, accompanied by a brief cry an instant later. When she turned around with a frown, she was met with the sight of a trembling maidservant prone on the ground and wailing constant apologies to her. Wenlan's face was full of fury as she set her eyes on the maidservant kneeling on the ground before them. She was using all of her willpower to refrain from shouting at the maidservant. Wenqing's brow furrowed as she held up Chu Lian's sleeve. "Third young madam, your dress." Chu Lian turned to look at her shoulder. A weird stain was spreading over the exquisite bamboo green fabric, which made it appear rather disconcerting. It was a cup of sincha that had been spilled on Chu Lian just now. The sincha of the Great Wu dynasty consisted of various spices. The strange mixture was much more difficult to clean, compared to most stains. Furthermore, there was a strange odor that was unbearable to the senses. Chu Lian stared at her stained sleeve for a few seconds. The maidservant who had bumped into her with the sincha earlier continued to kowtow and apologize. Chu Lian waved her hand to dismiss the maidservant. Even though she had already tried her best to be as low-key as possible, the commotion at their table had still attracted the attention of others. Chu Lian's stepmother, second madam, rushed over. Her expression didn't look too good. She immediately berated the troublemaking maidservant the moment she arrived and ordered two senior servants to drag the culprit away. Once that was taken care of, she finally walked up to Chu Lian. When she saw the stain on her sleeve, she exclaimed, "Miss Lian, you can't wear this dress anymore. Mother will arrange for you to change in a room nearby." Although Chu Lian didn't like this stepmother of hers, she couldn't reject second madam under the watchful eyes of the crowd around her. She apologized to her cousins and excused herself from the table. She followed behind second madam with Wenlan and Wenqing in tow and left the banquet hall to change in another room. On the way there, second madam was all smiles. "Miss Lian, your figure is similar to Miss Yuan's. I'll take you to the room first and send someone to bring over a set of Miss Yuan's clothes. Is that all right?" Chu Lian didn't want to spend any more time with second madam than she absolutely had to. Miss Su had given her a warning earlier, so she was already inwardly taking precautions against the second branch of housing. Chu Lian nodded her head. Second madam smiled when she saw that she hadn't rejected the offer. Second madam was certainly good at acting. Those not in the know would surely believe that she was Chu Lian's birth mother. She led Chu Lian to a quiet room nearby, then turned around to order the handmaid behind her to fetch the change of clothes. She immediately put on an apologetic expression while saying, "Miss Lien, I can't leave the outer court for too long. I'll have to leave you here by yourself." Chu Lien showed a light smile. "Mother, go ahead. I'll have my maidservants here with me, so there won't be any problems." Second Madam kindly patted Chu Lien's hand before turning around to leave. After confirming that Second Madam had really left, Chu Lien immediately stood up. Wenqing was puzzled by her sudden action. "Third young madam, what's wrong?" Resolution shown in Chu Lien's gaze. "We're leaving right now and returning to the estate." Chapter 542, Escape, 1, Oh. "But you haven't changed out of this dress." Wenlan was currently using a handkerchief to soak up as much of the wet stain as she could. "There's no time for that. We have to leave now." Ever since that maidservant had bumped into her and gotten her clothes dirty, she had been feeling that something wasn't right. She wasn't seated at the main table and her table was placed right along the side of the hall. Even the maidservant serving tea wouldn't walk right by her. Furthermore, with Miss Sue's warning still fresh in her mind, the whole incident seemed even more fishy. Although Chu Lien had brought Wenqing and Wenlan with her just in case, there wasn't an absolute guarantee of her safety even with their martial arts skills. This was the Ying estate, not the Jing'an estate. She wasn't the original Chu Lien and she wasn't familiar with this place. There was still Xiao Bojian waiting somewhere in the shadows too. She couldn't be sure that she wouldn't get into trouble. Thus, the best way to avoid any unfortunate accidents was to leave right now. When she thought back to the incident at Defing Tea House and how Wenqing and Wenlan combined hadn't been enough to stop Xiao Bojian, a wave of fear swept over her. Chu Lien was starting to regret attending Chu Yuan's coming of age now. Of course, Wenqing and Wenlan obeyed Chu Lien's orders unconditionally. The three women immediately got up to prepare to leave the secluded room. When Chu Lien pushed the door open, she spotted a plain-looking purple-clothed maidservant standing guard right outside. Various thoughts flew lightning-fast through her mind. There weren't any guards outside when they had entered the room. When had this maidservant appeared? In the time it took for those thoughts to pass through her mind, she shot Wenqing a meaningful look. Wenqing flew forward with an outstretched claw, ready to capture the maidservant. The purple-clothed maidservant subconsciously reacted to the attack and bent over, managing to dodge Wenqing's grasp. Alarms blared in Chu Lien's head. That was no ordinary menial servant. She was a martial arts practitioner. It wasn't just Chu Lien who had a bad feeling about all of this now. Even Wenqing and Wenlan could sense the danger approaching. Before Chu Lien had the chance to give any orders, the Wen sisters had already moved in front of her and started tangling with the purple-clothed maidservant. Chu Lien only knew some basic self-protection moves, which were nothing when faced with a true practitioner of martial arts. All she could do was watch anxiously as Wenqing and Wenlan exchanged blow after blow with the purple-clothed maidservant. She could tell that the seemingly normal servant was very skilled. Even though she was up against two opponents, she hadn't lost much ground. Chu Lien knew that she had already fallen into a trap. She was afraid that even Wenqing and Wenlan wouldn't be able to protect her if she didn't escape quickly. Right now, there was only this one unfamiliar maidservant watching this secluded room. However, more were sure to come as time passed. Wenqing and Wenlan couldn't keep this fight up forever either. With a quick turn of wit, Chu Lien took out a cloth purse from her waistband and quickly stepped forward. She waited for a chance when the guard wasn't looking and threw a packet of red powder right into the purple-clothed maidservant's face. The maidservant let out a cry of pain and immediately shut her eyes. Tears flowed continuously down her cheeks. Wenqing. Wenlan. The Wen sisters reacted equally fast and captured the purple-clothed maidservant together. They stuffed a handkerchief into her mouth and Wenqing knocked her out with a chop to her neck. When all that was done, they looked towards Chu Lien. Chu Lien made a snap decision: search her and look for clues, then hide her on the bed inside. Wenqing and Wenlan worked quickly and did as Chu Lien had ordered. Unfortunately, they didn't manage to find anything on the purple-clothed maidservant's body. "Let's go," Chu Lien stated calmly. With the Wen sisters protecting her on both sides, they made a hasty exit from the room while hoping no one had discovered them. Chapter 543, Escape, 2. Since she had visited the Ying estate once before, Chu Lien had a rough idea of the layout of the estate. Although they passed a few servants along the way, the servants were all low-ranked and they didn't dare to question why Chu Lien had appeared there at that time. They reached the side entrance without any obstructions. Wenqing found House Jingan's guards and driver and helped Chu Lien up the carriage. Without further ado, they left the Ying estate. When Chu Lien was finally sitting safely in the carriage, her heart was still beating rapidly. That was too close. Wenqing's expression was still grim as she poured a cup of warm water for Chu Lien. "Third young madam, please have a cup of water to calm your nerves." Chu Lien took the teacup in her hands without bringing it up to her lips, she simply held it in a daze. Wenlan was filled with self-reproach. "Third young madam, it was this servant's fault for being so unskilled. This servant couldn't even beat a maidservant and third young madam was almost in danger. If not for that bag of chili powder that Chu Lien had thrown, the Wen sisters couldn't possibly have subdued that purple-clothed maidservant so quickly." Chu Lien returned to reality and shook her head. "You don't have to blame yourselves. That maidservant was specially trained, so it's normal that you weren't able to beat her. We left in such a hurry that we didn't get to inform my husband. Send someone to inform him now." Wenqing nodded and left to carry out her orders. Back in the Ying estate. The banquet was in full swing in the parlor of the outer court. A senior servant whispered something into Miss Yuan's ear over at the female guest's side of the party. A satisfied glint flashed through Miss Yuan's eyes. She clutched her handkerchief with excitement. She whispered a few words in reply to the senior servant who had come to report. The senior servant bobbed in acknowledgement and left the parlor. He Changdi had been delayed by official business and had only been able to leave the Ministry of War after 2 p.m. Once past the gates of the ministry, he urged his horse into a gallop and headed straight for the Ying estate. Upon entering the estate, he was informed that the banquet had already started. A manservant guided him over to the parlor where the banquet was being held. Before He Changdi even had the chance to greet the officials in attendance at the banquet, he first sent Liyue off to notify Chu Lien. When Liyue returned, his expression didn't look too good. The cool aura wrapped around He Changdi dipped a few degrees in temperature when he saw Liyue's expression. Those closest to him immediately ducked their heads out of fright at the building storm in his eyes. What happened? Speak. Liyue reported everything he had been told. "Third young master, please don't worry. Second madam brought third young madam into a side room for a change of clothes. Wenqing and Wenlan are with her, so she'll be fine." "Where is she? Take me there now." Liyue was good at his job and he had predicted that his master would want to see third young madam for himself, so he had already brought over one of second madam's senior servants to lead the way. An extraordinary aura was exuding from He Changdi's tall figure. He had survived the fields of war and killed Tuhuns with his own hands, so there was a military air around him. How could an old servant who had lived years in the sheltered inner court dare to slight him? The senior servant spoke carefully without ever raising her head in front of He Sanlang. She pointed out the way with light gestures. As they drew closer to their destination, He Sanlang noticed that their surroundings were becoming more secluded. His expression turned grim. The old servant felt that the air around her was starting to become even frostier, so she wiped the cold sweat on her forehead in fright. When she saw that they were almost there, she heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. My lord, it's right in front. There weren't many servants around in this quiet and secluded courtyard. When they passed the entrance, it was strangely silent. As Changdi strode down the corridor towards the guest room, he stiffened up and halted his steps, as if something had caught his attention. His senses were sharper than most, and the first thing he could hear was the abnormal sounds of lovemaking in the room. TL note: in case anyone was confused by Princess Royal vs. Royal Princess in Chapter 538, I've updated it with a note. Chapter 544, Leaving First. 1. The senior servant guiding them didn't notice that Changdi had stopped. She continued walking forward until she was closer to the guest room. By then, the sounds coming from the room had gotten so loud that the servant could hear them too. Blood rushed away from the senior servant's face and she turned back to look at Changdi with a petrified expression. Changdi's anger was written clearly all over his face, as the fire in his heart almost consumed his whole being. Luckily, he managed to hold on to his last shred of sanity. He stood there in the corridor without moving, as if taking the next step would be harder than fighting a whole war. The hands hanging at his sides had already curled into fists. Liyue was frightened by the sight of his master, as well as what the sounds meant. His mind turned completely blank and he didn't dare to finish his thoughts. If the person inside was really third young madam. Perhaps thanks to that last bit of reason clinging to his mind, as the seconds ticked by, Sanlang finally noticed that there was something wrong. The voice echoing from the room, husky with lust, wasn't Chu Lian. Once he had confirmed that, all of his wits and calm returned to him. His expression cooled down into its usual icy mask and he quickly strode forward on his long legs. He raised a foot and kicked the wooden doors wide open. Bam! The heavy wooden doors immediately flew out of the frame, making loud thunks as they hit the floor. Sanlang was about to step inside when an enraged roar sounded from behind. You can't go in. A familiar man's voice. Sanlang stood still for a moment before he turned around with his hands behind his back. Ha! So it was Xiao Wujing. As expected. Oh. Why can't I enter? My wife is in there. Sir Xiao. Sanlang's tone was frosty as he stared down Xiao Bojian. The man in question was obviously panicking while running towards him in a flurry. There were clear traces of genuine worry and fury in the eyes of the normally sinister and gloomy-looking Xiao Bojian. This wasn't what he had planned. Xiao Bojian didn't have any mind to pay attention to Changdi at this point. He attempted to charge right into the guest room impatiently, but Changdi wasn't such an easy opponent. Although Xiao Bojian also had a tall figure, he was still shorter than Changdi. Furthermore, he didn't practice martial arts and his body was more on the slender side. He wasn't a match for Sanlang at all. By simply reaching his arm out and applying a minimal amount of force, Changdi had already managed to pull Xiao Bojian behind him. Before Xiao Bojian could even react, his butt was already seated on the floor, courtesy of Changdi. One jumped in fright. He hadn't thought that his master would be so reckless. By the time he managed to chase up to his master, the dust had already settled on his sorry-looking master.